Wildfire and Steel, Mage Saga Book 3, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Chapter 15. When Carina woke, the first thing she noticed was the familiar vibration of a ship's engine. The boarders must have carried her onto their vessel. She was lying on a padded surface rather than the hard floor of a cell, and she didn't seem to be restrained. Good. The shearers who had captured them were clearly idiots. She opened her eyes to slits. The room was white and brightly lit. She could hear someone moving around, but she couldn't see the person due to the angle of her head. Her eyes faced the corner of the ceiling. She didn't want to move, or her captors would know she was awake. If they thought she was unconscious, they might say something significant. In the end, it was Darius's voice she heard. "Ow! Don't do that! No!" She was up in an instant, launching herself in the direction of her brother's voice. Darius was lying on his front on a bed, and someone was leaning over him and touching his hair. She leapt onto the man's back and grabbed his forehead and chin before wrenching his head around, trying to break his neck. "Whoa! Ah!" The man stumbled backward, sending her crashing into the wall. He stumbled forward. She clung to his back, feeling for his eyes. Together they fell onto some equipment. The metal implements scattered over the floor. The man fell down and rolled onto his back, trying to dislodge her. "Help!" he shouted. "Someone help me!" She raked her nails over his face, but failed to damage his eyes. She switched tactics and gripped his neck, digging hard into his arteries. Moments later, he relaxed under her grip. She crawled out from underneath his large, heavy body. One down, how many more to go? With disappointment, she saw he was unarmed. She stood up. There was movement in the doorway. She turned, but before she could see what had caused it, she felt the familiar and dreaded burst of a stun hitting her in the side. The next time she woke, she felt tight restraints around her wrists and ankles. Those shearer troops were getting smarter. But when she opened her eyes, she was surprised to see Bryce looking down at her. "You're back with us?" He touched her hair affectionately. "Don't worry, you're safe. We're all safe." "Huh?" She lifted her head. She was in the same place. Now she had time to have a good look at it. She realized it was a medical bay. Darius lay in the next bed along from hers, asleep. "They put me here to talk to you as soon as you woke up," said Bryce, "so you wouldn't go on another rampage. You already made yourself one enemy in that splicer you attacked." "I don't give a shit about a shearer splicer." "He isn't a shearer. He's a mage." "He's a what?" In order to see Darius better, she had lifted her head. It hit her pillow with a thump. "What the hell are you talking about?" "That guy you tried to kill, he's a mage. They call him a healer, though. He was cleaning dried blood out of Darius's hair when you woke up and launched a full-scale assault." Bryce seemed to find what he was saying very funny. "Oh." Her mind was spinning. "Mages picked us up? How? Who are they? Bryce, what's going on?" She wondered if she had been stunned in the head and was in a waking dream or going mad. "I don't know what's going on any more than you do. Apart from what I've told you, they've said they'll explain everything soon. They also said they aren't going to hurt us. They're here to help." Carina sat opposite the man she'd attacked, feeling slightly abashed about what she'd done, but the scratches she had gouged on his face were gone, and she guessed he must have healed any further damage she had done. From the look he was giving her, however, his opinion of her would take longer to heal. They were seated in a meeting room aboard the Mage's ship, the Haihu. Only she and her oldest sister had been invited to the meeting. Bryce, as a non-mage, had been excluded, and her brothers and sisters were deemed too young to attend. Parthenia was making her hatred clear, as usual. She was sitting several seats away at the round table. In all, 4 other mages were present, including an older woman, a young man, and a young woman. The healer was a large black-haired man. She caught her breath. She recognized him. He was one of the people she'd seen in her recurring dream. Parthenia was also looking at him curiously. "Shall we get the introductions over with?" the older white-haired woman asked. "I'm Ira, your captain. This is Ren, our navigator." The young man nodded. "And Ione, our weapons officer." The redhead smiled. "I believe you've already met our healer, Justin." Justin did not smile. "I'm Carina, and this is my sister, Parthenia." "Thank you," Ira said. Her gaze lingered a long moment on Carina and her sister before she continued. "Some explanations are in order from both sides. I'm hoping we can clear everything up today, or if not, over the course of our journey to Pyrene. As you are both mages, I'm sure I don't need to explain the importance of never divulging to anyone what you are about to hear. It is for your siblings' safety, as well as the safety of all mages, that we keep our secrets close to our hearts. We can only know what is essential to us at each stage of our lives. If, stars forbid, one day you are forced to give up your knowledge, you will be less likely to imperil the future of our clan." "I know," said Carina. Parthenia echoed, "I understand." "You are here, my dear," Ira said to Carina, "because you are close to the age where you could choose your match. You have been summoned to a matching." Responding to Carina and Parthenia's puzzled looks, the captain went on, addressing Carina again. "You have been dreaming of coming to Pyrene, haven't you?" "I think I've been having dreams, yes, but they faded quickly when I woke up. I didn't know what they were about. I didn't know I was being called to go somewhere." Ira sighed and traded glances with Justin. "Our spirit mage is very old and weak. Her casting is not powerful any longer. We've heard similar reports from the young mages who have already arrived. To explain, every 5 galactic years, young men and women mages are summoned by a spirit mage to a matching. The event takes place over several months, and the young mages can get to know each other and perhaps choose a life partner. That is what your dreams have been about, Carina. I'm guessing you have no living relatives apart from your younger sisters and brothers." "That's right." Ira looked pained. She continued, "If you had an older mage in your life, he or she would have explained what the dreams meant." "Right," said Carina. "But Darius has been having the dreams too, I think. He's only 6. "He has been summoned too," said Ira. "Though for a different reason. Your brother is a spirit mage. Only 1 or 2 are born per generation. As I said, our current spirit mage who performs the summons cast is ancient. She has a stronger connection with your brother than other mages. That was how she knew he was coming, and how she also knew his path had been diverted. We set out to retrieve him. It was a dangerous expedition. We were forced to destroy the ship pursuing you, and that act will attract unwanted attention. But it was vital that we found your brother. Without a spirit mage, our clan will die out." "I've never heard of a summon cast," Parthenia interjected. "That's because you can't do it," Justin replied. "Only spirit mages can." "Excuse me," said Parthenia, "but you look like someone I met once. Do you have a brother on Ostalon?" "Ah, so it was you who wandered up to Jace's tower by the forest." It was my brother and I. So Jace was a mage all along, and I worked so hard to get away from him. If only I'd known he could have helped us." "He would have helped you however he could," said Justin, "and gladly. But by the time he realized what you were, you'd slipped away. I cast transport right in front of him.
It was quite a shock from what he says.
That's the problem with all the secrecy, right? Said Wren. We could be the friend of another mage all our lives and never know it. You met a mage on Ostalon? Carina asked her sister. Parthenia's expression turned sour, and she replied without looking at Carina. He was the ranger who helped me and Darius when we found our way out of the forest. She turned to Justin. He's a good man. He saved us when we couldn't go any farther. The next time you see him, please thank him for me.
You can thank him yourself. He'll be on Pyrene soon, if he hasn't already arrived.
He's coming to the matching too? I thought it was just for young people.
Justin laughed a deep-bellied chuckle. He's only 35. I'll tell him you said that. But Jace is coming to the matching because...
Justin, Ira said sharply.
Sorry,
said the healer, suddenly serious.
I was forgetting. Jace will be at the matching too, Parthenia. He would have arrived earlier, but he was having problems leaving Ostalon due to the war.
Is the war over now? Carina asked. Yes, the Dirksons managed to repel the Shura attack, said Ira. Probably with my other brother's help. What? A mage is helping the Dirksons? It's a long story. We have a lot to discuss. You have another brother? Asked Ione. You have a big family. He's my half-sibling, like Parthenia and all the others. So you two have different parents, Ira said. I'm surprised. You look so alike. It's obvious you're sisters. Do you mind telling me? Do you share a mother? We did, Carina replied. Her name was Faye. Ira's features clouded. I feared it was so. I saw the resemblance right away, but I hoped I was mistaken. She's dead, then. She died a few months ago, said Carina. And Chris? He passed on many years ago, before Parthenia was born. Justin leaned forward and spread his arms on the table.
There are many sad tales to be told here, but let's save them for later. They're in the past now. You said you have another brother who you think is helping the Dirksons.
Ma had 6 children after me, said Carina. Parthenia is the eldest. The second child is a boy called Castiel. My mother thought he wasn't a mage, but then around the time she died he developed mage powers. Unfortunately, he'd watched the lessons she had given the other children, so he knew what he had to do in order to cast. You say unfortunately, said Ira. I'm guessing his behaviour is not what you would expect from a mage. No, it isn't, said Parthenia. Castiel is cruel and lusts for power and control. He has to be stopped. I wanted to try to stop him, but Carina forced me to leave Ostalon. The venomous look she shot Carina left the room in an embarrassed silence.
That seems to be yet another subject we can explore more deeply later. Are you in agreement over the nature of this young man?
There's no doubt about it, she replied. I'm not sure why he is as he is. Perhaps he takes after his father, or perhaps growing up without mage ability in a family of mages has warped him. But Castiel is evil. Ira's sombre expression deepened. I'm so glad you found us, said Parthenia. Maybe we can work together to defeat my brother. We certainly need to address that question, said Ira. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm worried that Castiel and the Dirksons may follow us, said Carina. I think the ship you attacked when you found us belonged to that clan.
It did. We had a rather terse exchange of comms. The ship's captain stated you were escaped prisoners of war. We declined to believe them.
He smiled grimly. But when the Dirksons don't hear anything from their ship, they'll send out another to find out what happened to it. Then they'll pick up your trace and follow it the same as they followed ours. No, they won't. No, they won't, said Ira. Don't worry. Wren has cast obscure on our trail and will continue to do so. It's extremely unlikely they would discover our path, and if they do, they would also need to search all of Pyrene to find us." Carina wasn't entirely reassured by Ira's words, but she bowed to the older woman's long experience. She also had more questions she was urged to ask. "Can you tell me more about my mother and father? I grew up without them. My Nine-Eye brought me up. I only met my mother again not long before she died." "I would love to," Ira replied. "I propose that we bring the meeting to a close first, however. I think we've touched on all the important topics for today. Thank you for what you've told us. Remember, do not tell anyone else anything we've discussed here. Your non-mage friend and your brothers and sisters will naturally make some guesses about what's happening, but it's really best for everyone that they know as little as possible for certain." Carina imagined it would be hard to not tell Bryce why they were going to Pyrene, how mages had found them, or answer any other mysteries that had been cleared up for her. But he probably wouldn't press her for answers. He understood the need for secrecy. The fact that she was supposed to attend this matching troubled her more. She wasn't of a mind to match to anyone. People were leaving the meeting room. Justin had risen from his seat and was walking past Carina when he halted, and she felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. When she looked up, he held out his other hand. Somewhat bewildered, she grasped it and they shook.
"There are not many who have made me cry for help,"
he said, a twinkle in the depths of his deep-set eyes. "I'm sorry. I hope I didn't hurt you."
"Nothing a little casting couldn't fix."
He released his grip and walked out. Carina was pleased to see her brothers and sisters put on weight and lose their worry lines as the days passed while the Haihu took them to Pyrene. Ira spent some time reminiscing with her about her mother and father. It turned out that she'd gotten to know them at a matching long ago, when Carina's parents had met. Ira told her what she recalled, mainly about how much in love her parents had seemed. That was one reason Ira remembered them so well. She listened hungrily as Ira spoke of her mother. She wanted to overlay her final memories of the poor woman, ravaged with disease and long years of cruelty, with mental images of her as a young, happy, innocent person in the first flush of love. When Ira told her about her father, she built memories of a man she had all but forgotten. She wished so much that mage law didn't prohibit keeping images of loved ones. She could barely remember Bar's face. She didn't tell Darius anything about what lay ahead of him on Pyrene, partly because she didn't have much of an idea what Ira's mention of training actually meant. The captain had said she couldn't tell her any more. The prospect worried her. Darius was only 6 years old. He might be a spirit mage, but he was still only a little boy, much too young to have the responsibility of the future of mages on his shoulders. Finally, the day came when they arrived at Pyrene's star system. Ira announced the fact when she came into the small mess one morning. Oriana clapped her hands. "Wonderful! I can finally have a proper bath and real food, though the ship's food is also nice," she added, remembering her manners. "We're all looking forward to real food," said Ira kindly. "But I'm afraid a bath won't be possible where we're going. I'll explain to you what happens next. We have to hide the Haihu at the edge of the system, then we take a shuttle in." "How come we don't go straight to Pyrene?" Fern asked. "I thought it was a mage planet." "There are no mage planets, Fern," said Ira. "Not any longer. Whenever mages settled a new planet, non-mages would come along and drive them out, until finally they had to hide within non-mage populations. Pyrene is no exception, though the people there are more tolerant and less suspicious of outsiders than most. We must keep our abilities secret on Pyrene, the same as everywhere. However, at the place we're going, everyone is a mage. It is a temporary encampment. After we arrive there, I must ask you not to question anyone about where they're from, or even ask their names if they do not volunteer them." "How long will we be staying?" asked Darius. "That isn't clear yet. We'll be transferring to the shuttle in about an hour. Make sure you're ready." The Haihu shuttle was a small silver oblong that barely fit everyone. Carina was quiet as they sped through the system toward the distant sun. So much had happened in the previous weeks. They had been in so much danger, but they had all survived relatively unscathed. Bryce, who was sitting next to her, took her hand. She smiled, but then an idea struck her. Would the mages at the encampment accept Bryce and Nala? Darius was sitting on Parthenia's lap because there weren't enough seats for everyone. He piped up rather proudly. "Ira, do you want me to cloak the ship?"
"What's that?" asked Justin.
Carina explained about Darius's special caste, and Ira said, "Yes, we would like that very much indeed. The Pyrene authorities aren't tight on security, but there's no point in taking risks we can avoid." 2 hours later, the shuttle touched down. It was a relief to leave the cramped ship. When Carina walked out the exit ramp, she was greeted by a familiar sight. They had landed in the middle of a grassy plain stretching out in all directions. She had never been to Pyrene in her life, but she realized she'd visited the planet many times in her dreams. "Please move forward," said Ira from behind. "You're blocking the exit. We must hide the shuttle as soon as we can." Carina walked out into the hot, dry atmosphere. It was around midday, and the air was exactly as she dreamed it, full of the scent of wildflowers and the sound of insects. "But where are we going to sleep?" asked Oriana.
"Over there,"
said Justin, pointing behind the shuttle. Carina turned and saw a collection of tents in the distance. "Ugh," said Oriana. "We're going to sleep in those." "Oh, shut up," said Fern. "It'll be great." They headed out toward the campsite, along a lightly worn path through the tall grass. A sound from behind made Carina turn, and she was just in time to see the shuttle disappearing beneath a shelter disguised as a pile of boulders. Before they had crossed half the distance, another familiar sight appeared. A very old woman hobbled out from the shadow of a tent. It was the woman from Carina's dreams, who she now remembered as clear as day, right down to the woman's piercing stare. Though she was almost bent double, she moved at a surprising speed as she closed the distance between them. She suddenly paused and lifted one hand to shade her eyes, while the other remained on her stick. "Darius," she called, her voice thin and feeble. "Darius, I can see you. Come here, sweet boy." Darius turned questioning eyes to Carina. She didn't know what to say. The old woman, who she guessed was the spirit mage, clearly recognized Darius. "Should I go, Carina?" "I guess so." Her brother walked faster than the group, so he was soon farther ahead. He met with the spirit mage about half a minute before the rest of them caught up to him. The mage had one bony arm across Darius's shoulders and was leaning her ancient face close to his youthful one. Her expression seemed to convey joy, but Carina also thought she saw a horrible glint of avarice in the old woman's eyes. Darius looked fearful. Chapter 16. Winter had arrived quickly at the mountain castle, and the rooms had grown even colder. As Castiel's servant, who he'd learned was called Vera, left his bed, he told her to maintain a constant fire for him. The innuendo of his request wasn't lost on him, and he smirked as she dressed. When his servant went out and closed the door, however, his smile faded. The wonder and pleasure he'd experienced when she'd offered herself so readily a few weeks ago had quickly palled. He'd discovered that fruit so easily acquired held no sweetness. At the same time, his desire for Sable Dirksen had escalated. While Vera was in his bed, Castiel imagined she was Sable. He even used the clan leader's name, and he acted out the degradations and perversions he planned to use on her when she became his. When that might happen was still uncertain, but he believed he edged closer toward the goal every day. Castiel threw back the covers and climbed out of bed. Despite the heating system the Dirksens had installed and the crackling fire in the grate, he shivered. The clammy chill never went away in the mountain castle abode. He pulled on his pants and put on a shirt, and then the thick padded jacket he'd ordered to be made. His clothes felt tight. He guessed he'd done some growing. His arms and chest certainly seemed more muscular. He faced the mirror and checked out his appearance. His beard nearly covered most of his jaw, and his face had lost some of its roundness. He imagined he must look similar to his father when he was young, all the more fitting that he should achieve father's ambition. What a pity he would not be around to witness it. He would have liked to make the old man proud. It was nearly time for dinner. Castiel left his room to go downstairs to the great hall. He didn't care about punctuality, but these days dinner time was about the only time of day when he could reliably speak to Sable. Most days she was gone from the castle, though she never told him where she went. He walked down the steps, remembering that horrible period when Sable had set him to helping with the restoration of the capital. How demeaning that had been. He should have refused her request or made his protest earlier. His most recent task of trying to extract information from the Shura spy who had given away intel about Ostalon had been far more enjoyable. He hadn't managed to find out anything useful, he had to admit, but he had had fun trying. When he strutted into the hall, he was surprised by the sight of a guest for dinner. Commander Key had joined them. Castiel hadn't seen the man since his first day at the castle, when he'd made the unfortunate error of killing Tremoil. He wondered what had happened to Calverley. He hadn't heard anything about the old man. "Commander Key," said Castiel in a statesman-like manner as he arrived at the dinner table. "You're with us again. Do you have something important to report?" Key gave him a sardonic look, and Castiel noticed the man failed to stand up and salute him. "Now then, Castiel," said a voice. Sable stood in the doorway. "Don't tempt the commander into giving away secrets." She entered the hall, looking magnificent. She was wearing a floor-length high-necked gown made of a rich, thick black fabric. Castiel had expected a woman of her wealth and status to wear expensive jewellery, like the kind his father had given his mother, but as always Sable wore none. Somehow the absence of decoration made her appear more impressive. Key pushed back his chair, stood, and saluted as she approached the table. Castiel scowled and pulled out a chair, deliberately scraping the legs across the stone floor. He threw himself into his seat. How dare Sable imply he was not allowed to hear Dirksen's secrets? How much longer would he be treated as an outsider? Sable and Key ignored his petulance and sat down. "Thank you for joining us, Commander," said Sable. "I know you must be tired after your flight."
"It's always a pleasure to attend you, ma'am."
"I read over your report just now, but I'd also like to hear it in your own words. That was why I requested your presence tonight."
"Ah."
Key's gaze flicked to Castiel. "You can speak freely in front of Castiel. This business concerns him." Castiel perked up. "I'm all ears." He took a sip of wine. Over his weeks at Sable's castle, he'd become more accustomed to the drink and could now tolerate 3 or 4 glasses before becoming unsteady. He'd been careful not to repeat the shameful event of his first taste of alcohol.
"In that case," said Key, "as I wrote, ma'am, we confirmed the debris we found was from the Torpil. the destroyer we sent in pursuit of the Mage children. We were unable to establish the cause of the ship's destruction. We found no impact site. It was as if the ship exploded from within.
They probably cast fire into the ship's fuel tanks, said Castiel, with a tone that he hoped made him appear knowledgeable. That was how Carina and the others destroyed your shipyard. They knew where the tanks were, you see. I thought you said it was you who destroyed our shipyard, said Sable. Castiel felt blood heating his cheeks. That was what I meant. Continue, Key.
I'm not convinced it was the Mage children who destroyed the Torpil. It might have been another ship. We found the shuttle, adrift but empty, without any bodies inside. That made little sense to me. The only explanation accounting for all the evidence was the Torpil picked up the Mages but was then destroyed by an unknown force. Would the Mage children commit an act of self-destruction? It seems unlikely. So we searched. That was the cause of our delay, ma'am. We were combing the territory for any signs of a trace from a third ship. Luckily for us, the area is rarely frequented. We finally picked up some patchy signs a week's travel from the site of the Torpil's destruction. They led in the direction of a planetary system with a single inhabited planet called Pyrene.
I looked up Pyrene when I saw your report, said Sable. The planet doesn't seem to have any significance. I don't understand why a ship from there would travel out to the shuttle to collect the children. Perhaps Castiel can shed some light. Do you remember hearing anyone in your family refer to that planet? Castiel trawled his memory. No, I don't. I think it's unlikely anyone did. We never used to talk about other planets. Father didn't place much emphasis on galactic topography in our education. Could the ship have been a Shura vessel? Sable asked Key.
Impossible to say yet, ma'am.
Pyrene has never demonstrated sufficient potential for either us or the Shuras to take control of it. The economy is almost entirely agrarian due to the scarcity of natural resources. The only explanation for what you observed that makes sense to me is that a portion of the Shura fleet fled there after their failed attempt to take Ostalon. Did you find any evidence that might support that scenario, Key?
We didn't approach the planet closely, but from what we could tell, the evidence of space traffic seemed normal for a planet of Pyrene's low economic and political importance. But the trace we were following disappeared at the system's edge. Consequently, we weren't able to ascertain where the ship landed, if in fact it ended up on Pyrene itself.
Disappearing traces, said Sable. That sounds like mage work. You mean these people could be hiding out on an uninhabited planet or moon somewhere in the system?
A moon would be the only possibility. The other planets are high-gravity or gaseous giants, unfit for human life.
Well, it seems we have narrowed down the possibilities considerably. Thank you for your excellent work, Key. Now we have to act. What do you think we should do, Castiel? Jerked from reverie, Castiel splashed wine on himself. He put down his glass and picked up a napkin. As he dabbed at himself, disconcerted, he replied, We should travel to Pyrene and find my brothers and sisters. As you said, Sable, as long as they aren't working for us, they're a liability. We can't allow the Shuras to have them. They would be even less of a liability if we killed them, said Sable. What do you think about that? Killed them? The idea appealed. He had always imagined himself controlling his siblings in the same way as father had. As well as all the things he could do with their help, it would be payback for years of living as a second-class member of his own family. Yet Sable had a point. With no other mages around, his own abilities would become rarer and more precious. He would have no competition, no one to make him look lesser. The thought of ending the lives of the siblings he'd grown up with gave him a strange sensation. Was this how guilt felt? Never mind, he would soon get over it. It might be difficult to kill them due to their abilities, especially my half-sister, Carina. She trained as a merc, but though they can cast, they're still human and can be killed in the same ways. Key had been watching Castiel as he spoke. At this last sentence he turned his head away in disgust. Sable's expression remained enigmatic. Castiel recalled her statement the first time he'd met her, that she couldn't stand disloyalty. Had he said the wrong thing? It couldn't be helped. If his siblings' deaths were necessary for his elevation to power, so be it. He wouldn't shed a tear for any of them, least of all Carina. "Very well," said Sable. "What's clear is that we must prepare a small fleet to fly to Pyrene. I want to find these mages before they become a threat. If we can't put them to work for us, we'll put them out of action permanently. How long will it take for you to equip a cruiser?"
"The repairs on the Elsinore are nearly complete, ma'am," said Key. "I would only need another 2 days to make her ready."
"We can work out the details later. Castiel, are you excited to finally have something to get your teeth into?"
"Me? You mean I'm going too?"
"Of course. Who better to defeat mages than another mage?"
"Great!"
Castiel exclaimed. Then he reasserted his composure.
"That's excellent news. I'll look forward to it."
Despite his intention to restrain himself, Castiel drank too much that evening. He was overjoyed that Sable was finally including him in an important, noteworthy task. While she and Key chatted about what troops to assign to finding and capturing or killing his siblings, Castiel ran through many scenarios in his mind, each involving a moment of supreme triumph. He would either decisively repulse his brothers and sisters' castes, resulting in their capture, or he would order soldiers to shoot them. Or perhaps he would trick them into a trap and lock them up, depriving them of their elixir so they were weak and helpless. The last scenario triggered a realization. He hadn't brought his elixir with him to the dining table. Not long after he'd arrived at the castle, he'd told Sable he needed something more convenient and portable than his glass bottle in which to carry the liquid essential to casting. She had suggested he commission an Ostalonian craftsman to create something. Castiel had found a metal worker who had made him an ornate canister inscribed with his initials. Usually he went everywhere with it, but tonight he didn't have it with him. The warmth the alcohol had given him drained away in a moment and was replaced by a chill. Castiel felt naked, and Sable and Key, who were chatting animatedly about ship-to-ground weapons, seemed suddenly dark and distant. Without his elixir, he was nothing and nobody. Sable could kick him out of the castle and tell one of her servants to break his back on a rock, and there would be nothing he could do about it. "Are you feeling unwell?" Sable asked, noticing the change in him.
"Maybe Mom should ask someone to bring in a bucket,"
Key quipped. Castiel swallowed.
"I'm all right. I'm just tired. I think I'll go to bed now."
"Good night, then," said Sable, immediately returning her attention to Key. Castiel stood up, the backs of his knees pushing away his chair. He wavered and grabbed the tabletop for support. Key rolled his eyes. Castiel walked off unsteadily. He had to get to his elixir. He'd left it in his room. He only needed to feel the reassuring touch of the cold metal canister. He vowed to never be without it again. He took the elevator, even though his room was on the next floor. It was faster, and he didn't trust himself on the steps. To fall down would be the height of embarrassment. When the elevator doors opened, he leaned on one edge for support as he stepped out into the corridor. As soon as he reached his room, Castiel went straight to the bedside drawer where he kept the canister. He pulled it open and blinked for a few moments as he took in what he saw. Horror struck him. The drawer was empty. He pulled out the one below it and the third one. Then he pulled out all the drawers and scrabbled around the empty frame. He pulled the furniture away from the wall and threw it across the room. Where could his elixir be? He was certain he'd put the canister in its usual place before Vera had come to pay him her daily visit. He searched his room, stripping the covers from his bed, tossing the pillows onto the floor. He peered underneath the bed and then dragged it away from the wall. He remembered the clothing chest in the corner of the room. Of course, he must have put the elixir in there by accident. But when he lifted the lid and hauled out all the clothes, the canister wasn't inside. Where could it be? He grabbed his hair in frustration. He had to find the precious liquid. Everything depended on it. If it wasn't in his room, it had to be because someone had stolen it. Perhaps Vera was the thief. The stupid girl was infatuated with him. She'd taken it in order to have something of his. Or perhaps another servant had taken it, imagining they could sell the canister for a good price. That had to be the answer. One of the servants had taken it. He would have to find out who it was and demand that Sable fire them, after punishing them heavily. He marched out of his room, anger driving away the effects of his excessive drinking. He ran down the stairs and rushed into the great hall. "One of your servants has stolen my elixir," he blurted. Key was standing and pushing in his chair. Sable was draining her glass. Both turned to Castiel, their eyes widening at his outburst. "I demand that all the servants' quarters are searched until it's found, and then the thief must be punished severely."
"Your elixir?" asked he. "Do you mean this?"
He picked up Castiel's canister from the tabletop. It had been there all along. He must have put it down somewhere he couldn't see it, and in his drunken state he'd assumed he'd forgotten it. He wished he could undo his outburst. He wished he could wind time back by 1 minute, but he couldn't. "Yes," he said quietly, "that's it." Key maintained a sardonic gaze on Castiel as he crossed the hall. The commander held the canister out at arm's length, waiting for Castiel to take it from him. When the container changed hands, Castiel returned to the staircase, feeling Sable and Key watching him the entire way. They were silent, but after he'd climbed a few steps and was out of their sight, Sable's laughter pealed out and was quickly joined by Key's loud, deep chuckles. Castiel opened the door to his room and surveyed the mess he'd created. He was furious. He hated Sable and Key for laughing at his mistake. He hated that he'd done something so stupid. One thing was clear. He wasn't going to sleep in the disarray caused by his frantic search. He went to his interface and called the servants' quarters, demanding that Vera come up to his room instantly and tidy it up. He flung himself onto his bed. He would take out his anger on the girl. A minute later there was a knock at the door and it opened. The servant panting outside wasn't Vera but another young girl. Castiel sat up in surprise. "Where's Vera?" "I don't know, sir," the girl replied, catching her breath. "I was told I am to be your room servant from now on. My name is—" "I don't give a shit what your name is. I want to know what—" Did he really want to know what had happened to Vera? Not at all. Or at least, not if this girl could meet his needs in the same way. She was certainly as pretty as Vera had been. "I want you to tidy up this mess," he said. "But that isn't all. Come over here." The girl took quick steps across the room until she was only a few feet from his side. "Take off your clothes." To Castiel's surprise, the girl complied with his instructions without a moment's hesitation. His eyes widened. It was so easy. Vera hadn't been a fluke. It was much easier than he'd been led to believe in the stories he'd read and dramas he'd watched. But maybe it wasn't so remarkable. After all, he was an important member of the Dirksen household. Of course the girl would do whatever he wanted. Perhaps what was happening was normal in rich and powerful clans. Come to think of it, he remembered seeing his father caressing the female servants in the mansion on Ithia. So this was normal. If only he'd realized earlier, he could have had so much more fun. The girl was naked. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Castiel barked. "Get on the bed." His former anger over his embarrassing mistake returned. He would work it out of his system on this girl. She would soon perform her service in as much discomfort and pain as he could inflict, and afterward he would watch as she tidied up his room. He used the servant roughly, yet though she didn't enjoy it, she didn't seem to mind too much. He wondered if she'd been beaten frequently at home, and so she'd become insensitive to pain. When he was finished, he pushed her away. "Get dressed." "No, wait. Pick up in here before putting your clothes on. Then you can leave." "Yes, sir." The girl climbed off the bed, and Castiel let his gaze linger on her welts and developing bruises. He had exhausted himself. He could have performed more interesting feats by casting, but it would not have been as satisfying or cathartic. Expending his strength was much better. His drunkenness had worn off too, and he felt the beginnings of a headache. When the girl was gone, he would heal himself before he slept. His eyelids drooping, he watched the servant as she folded the clothes scattered about the floor and carefully laid them inside the chest in the corner. Was she smiling to herself? It seemed she was. His eyelids lifted, and he pulled himself back from the brink of sleep. Why was the girl smiling? Was she a masochist? Had she enjoyed all that he'd done to her? He felt cheated. What he'd done was for his pleasure, not hers. If she liked it, that took away most of the point of the exercise. He thought back to Vera. She also hadn't seemed to particularly mind what he did to her, no matter how brutal he'd been. It was a strange coincidence that the two servants had reacted in the same way. It was too much of a coincidence. He wasn't as experienced as he hoped to become, but even he knew that most women didn't like being ill-treated. He'd seen his mother shrink from his father's approach often enough. So why? He sat bolt upright. "You!" He pointed at her, though he couldn't possibly mean anyone else. "Why are you here?" "I'm your room servant, sir." He was out of bed in an instant and by her side. He grabbed a fistful of the girl's hair and wrenched it, twisting her neck and bending her head almost to the floor. "Why are you really here?" "Ow! Please, sir, please! Let me go!" She fell to her knees. "Ha! You don't like it so much now, do you? Not now there's no point to it. Not now you aren't exciting me." Castiel had a vision of throwing the girl down and stomping on her face until she told him the answer. But Sable Dirksen had probably threatened even worse punishments. Sable was no mage, however. She couldn't stop him from finding out the truth, though he already knew it. He just wanted to hear it from the girl's lips. "Stay there." In 3 strides he was across the room and taking his elixir canister from the drawer. He sipped the liquid, closed his eyes, and cast Enthrall. He opened his eyes. The girl's stare was blank when he returned to her. "You, why were you sent here?" "I am your room," He kicked her.
"What was the other reason you were sent here?"
"I am to allow you to use me, sir."
"And why is that?"
Castiel's hands were clenching into fists. "So that I may become pregnant, sir. If I give birth to a live child sired by you, my family will be richly rewarded."
He let out a roar and punched the girl in the face. "And Vera, she is pregnant? That's why you replaced her?"
"Yes, sir."
Castiel knocked the girl down. She lay where she fell, blood oozing from her nose. He began to kick her over and over. Sable Dirksen had been tricking him the whole time. After he'd told her that magehood was passed on from parent to child, she had hatched a plan to force him to sire children for her. More mages who would be entirely under her control. Damn her! Damn Sable Dirksen and all her schemes! He would not forget her treachery and deceit. Not for a very long time.
Chapter 17. When Carina and her siblings had arrived at the matching, they carried little more with them than the clothes on their backs. Not long after they walked into the camp, however, with Ira, Justin and the rest of the crew of the Haihu, they had food, somewhere to sleep, and the warmest welcome Carina had ever known. It had taken her days to become accustomed to the idea that she no longer had to hide what she was from strangers, because everyone she met was the same as her. She had never known a time when she had not been forced to keep her abilities secret, with the threat of torture, slavery, or death hanging over her. The new sense of freedom was dizzying, and her brothers and sisters seemed to feel the same. After a childhood of spent living under the domination of their father in a household full of pain and long months of hiding and running, they could finally relax and be themselves. The boys and girls had become more childlike, playing endlessly in the long grass of the prairie. Over the days they had grown fatter and the colour had returned to their faces. While the children played, Carina had spent time wandering around the camp. She discovered there was no formal structure to the matching. Over the course of months, young mages would arrive, spend as much time at the camp as they wanted, and then leave at a time of their choosing. Some left with partners they had met. Others had the locations of new friends memorized in order to arrange later meetings. A few left without either of these things, but it seemed not unhappily. Perhaps they would return for the next matching, or perhaps they were content to remain single. The young mages passed their days meeting and talking with others over meals or drinks. Some had brought musical instruments and gave performances. Others sang, recited poetry, or put on plays. Some taught skills like cooking and crafting. Carina's memory of her dreams became stronger now she was actually at the place she had dreamed about, and the camp retained a dreamlike quality. She almost could not believe it was real. Was it because it felt too good to be true, and if she truly believed in it, the place might suddenly vanish in a puff of smoke? As if to keep her anchored in the more familiar, harsh world outside the matching, two aspects of the camp marred her experience. The first was that she did not fit in. The young mages she met had clearly been raised in loving families, and if they had experienced hardship, it was only of the economic kind. The second problem Carina had with the camp was how Darius's days were spent. While his brothers and sisters played, he spent most of his time with the spirit mage. When he returned to their tent after a long day of training with the old woman, he was often too tired to play and would fall asleep soon after dinner. Darius said he was helping the spirit mage, whose name was Magda, with her summoning, and she had begun to teach him some things only spirit mages could do. Carina's unease about the situation increased, but she wasn't sure what to do about it. One thing that particularly saddened her was that Darius was asleep in the evenings when the spirit mage told her stories, though she guessed Darius would eventually know all the stories himself. It turned out that one of Magda's roles was to function as the repository for the oral history of the clan. Every night, a couple of hours after sunset, someone would build a large fire in the center of the encampment, and the spirit mage would sit beside it and tell a story from the mage's ancient past. She told a different story every night, and would often say she knew more stories than she could tell at one matching. Though Carina disliked the way the old woman had monopolized Darius, she would often attend these storytellings. Parthenia would come to listen to the stories too, but Carina knew better than to attempt to sit with her sister. When she had tried, Parthenia had gotten up and walked away, drawing the curious stares of others. So instead, Carina usually found a space at the edge of the crowd, far from the fire, and sat on a blanket spread over the damp, flattened grass. She would cover her shoulders with another blanket and listen. One evening the spirit mage told a very old story from the time the mages departed their home planet, Earth. Carina's attention increased in focus when she understood what the subject was to be. She had never given up her dream of returning to Earth one day. At that time, most of Earth's population was living in a country called Antarctica, said Magda, which spanned the southern pole. The equatorial regions were desert wastelands, too hot for human survival, and the land masses in between were tropical wildernesses, disease-ridden, and the sites of frequent hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods. Some communities survived in the high mountains, and the Mage clan was one of these. Earth had not always been in this state, with so few areas suitable for human habitation. Humanity had lived and thrived all over the globe for hundreds of thousands of years, but successive decades of poor management of the planet had driven its systems to extremes that were not compatible with human life in most areas. The planetary government's proposed solution to this crisis was to approach the Mage clan and insist they use their special abilities to fix the damage and return Earth to its previous livable state. No amount of explanation would convince the government this task was entirely beyond mages. Or perhaps the government did not want to hear. Perhaps all it needed was a scapegoat, for its next step was to announce to the world's media that the Mage clan had refused to aid humankind, that it was waiting for non-mages to die out. Then mages would make Earth into a paradise only they could enjoy. The government employed technology that put words into the mouths of the Mage Council on vids and hollows. Try as they might to deny the lies, the mages were not believed. Perhaps the rest of the population wanted to believe the deceit, which made them easy to convince. By that time, mages had long been feared and hated. Rumours abounded of what kind of people they were and how they lived in their secret mountain castles, most of which were untrue. The mages were so divorced from regular human life, they rarely attempted to correct what was said about them. Due to the government's propaganda as it sought to deflect the blame for its failings, resentment against mages grew ever stronger. The clan came to the decision that remaining on Earth was simply too dangerous. If they did not leave, one day their mountain abodes would be attacked and they would be murdered or enslaved. The engine that permitted interstellar travel had been invented, and the mages determined they would be among the first to abandon Earth for the stars. It took them longer than 2 Earth years to construct their colony ship, but eventually the day came when they were to board the vessel and depart their home forever. A few of the clan did not want to leave. Many sad goodbyes were said, and then the thousands began to transport to the launch site. Though the construction of the ship had taken place in great secrecy, word had gotten out to the general populace that the mages were departing Earth. The first mages transporting into the site found a scene of bloody murder and destruction. People who had hated mages all their lives also did not want them to leave. They demanded the clan remain on Earth and help the rest of humankind. They said it was their duty and responsibility. So these non-mages had tried to prevent the ship from leaving by killing those who guarded it. They were also trying to sabotage the engines when the colonists arrived. A battle ensued, and though the mages transported many of those who were trying to prevent them from leaving, for the first time they were forced to kill in order to protect themselves. They won the battle, and they knew their time on Earth was done. Thus it was, with great sorrow and shame, our ancestors departed their home, never to return. The spirit mage fell silent. The story was over. After the mage had taken a drink and a few moments to gather her thoughts, she would begin another. The evening was growing late, and possibly the next story she told would be the last tonight. Parts of this story of leaving Earth were new to Carina. Ma had told her that mages had left due to persecution, but she hadn't given her the details about the state of the planet. Carina wondered if her ambition to return to Earth was foolish. She might go to a massive effort to arrive at the home planet only to find a barren wilderness. As she was contemplating this idea, a figure approached out of the darkness. The man was tall and broad, and at first she thought it was Justin who had come to listen, but then she saw the man's beard was shorter. She peered over at him and was surprised to see him sit down next to Parthenia. The two talked quietly while the spirit mage began her next story. She guessed the newcomer was Justin's brother, the ranger at the tower on Ostalon. She did not listen to the new story. The spirit mage's tale seemed to have sucked away her hopes for a future of safety and happiness, far from this galactic sector. She realized she had been listening to Magda's story so avidly because she'd been hoping to hear information that would give clues to Earth's location. But the latest story had driven home the fact that her clan had been intent on getting as far from Earth as they could, not returning there. In the story that had been passed down, no galactic coordinates were mentioned. Yet there was the map, which Carina had drawn thousands of times over as a child, and which she still recalled every time she meditated. Someone in the distant past of mages had wanted Earth's location to be remembered, perhaps long after its galactic coordinates had become obsolete and meaningless. She pondered the problem, withdrawing into herself, until before she knew it, the spirit mage's final story was over, and the crowd was breaking up to go to bed. She stood and shook out her legs to ease their stiffness. Parthenia and the ranger remained seated together and talking. Carina walked over to the pair. The ranger noticed her approaching and rose to his feet, holding out his hand.
"Carina, my name is Jace. It's nice to meet you again."
Parthenia turned her face away. Carina shook the ranger's hand, somewhat perplexed. "Again? Have we already met?"
"Yes, though only briefly, before you and your brothers and sisters disappeared."
"Huh?" She wondered what he meant. Then the penny dropped and her eyes widened. "Of course! How stupid of me! That was you at the forest on Ostalon."
"It was. I was walking alone after dark, laying low and waiting for the hostilities between the Shurers and Dirksons to blow over, so I could leave the planet and come here, when I spotted a fire in among the trees. I made my way over, wondering who could be there so far from civilization. I saw your shelter and went in for a closer look. And then I also guessed you must have something to do with the mage children I had helped weeks previously, one of whom I finally found again."
He smiled at Parthenia, but she continued to hold her face averted. Jace frowned in confusion. "It's okay," said Carina. "It isn't you Parthenia is mad at, it's me." She took a breath and let it out in a sigh, ashamed of what she was about to admit. "I cast enthrall on her to force her to leave Ostalon," Jace asked, eyes widening.
"That was—"
He paused, too polite to state his opinion. "A terrible thing to do," said Carina. "I know, and I hated to do it, but I didn't want Parthenia to die." She paused again. Her guilt and unhappiness regarding her relationship with her sister overcame her, and words flooded from her mouth without hindrance. "She means so much to me. Her help was invaluable when we escaped the Shurers. I could never have done it without her, and after that she kept our brothers and sisters safe in dangerous, difficult circumstances. She's quick-thinking, resourceful, and smart, and I love her. I couldn't leave her on Ostalon, even if it meant taking away her free will. I'm sorry for it, but I don't regret it. I would do the same again, because I can't bear to lose her, not after losing Ma." Carina hadn't been aware what she was going to say before she said it, yet she'd meant it all, and she was glad she'd had the opportunity to tell her sister how she felt. Parthenia's head remained turned away, but Carina sensed a small change in her, as if her sister had been affected by what she'd said.
"I think I understand what happened," said Jace. "You faced a hard choice."
"I didn't have a good option to pick."
"But I don't know that staying on Ostalon was as dangerous as you'd think. As long as you avoided the populated areas, you should have been fairly safe. I myself only had to wait until regular space travel was allowed again before I could leave."
"Oh, you don't know about our brother Castiel?" asked Parthenia.
"No, I haven't heard that name. I only just arrived."
"That's a long story," said Carina, "and a discussion we need to have with Magda, Justin, and anyone else who's in charge here. But the short version is, I believe our brother may be a dark mage, and he's helping the Dirksons."
"A dark mage? That is bad news. So that was why you didn't want to leave your sister on Ostalon? It makes more sense now. Dark mages are difficult to defeat, even for many mages working together. You could not have accomplished that alone, Parthenia."
"But we must try," she said. "We can't allow Castiel to do whatever he wants. He's cruel and vicious. He'll cause untold suffering." "You mean like the untold suffering non-mages have caused us over millennia?" asked Carina. "Honestly, the more I think about it, the less certain I am we should do anything about Castiel. Hearing the spirit mage's story has made me consider changing my mind. Think about it, Parthenia. The Shurers knew what your father was doing, and they didn't do anything to stop him. They chose not to do anything because you were all useful to them. Why should we help humankind when they've never helped us? We haven't done anything to deserve the persecution we've suffered. I know I said I would go back to Ostalon to tackle Castiel, but now I'm not so sure." "How can you say that?" Parthenia exclaimed. "Castiel deserves to be punished for everything he's done. He must be locked away and prevented from harming anyone, and we're the only ones who can defeat him." "I don't know about that either. Your father did a good job of controlling his mage wife and offspring. Maybe Castiel isn't as invincible as you think. Maybe the Dirksons already have him under their control. Even now he could be suffering torture to force him to do their bidding. I'm sorry, Parthenia. I'm not sure this is our fight." Jace said,
"One thing is certain. This subject needs further discussion, but not tonight. Let me speak with my brother and the spirit mage. What to do about a dark mage in our midst is a decision that will impact us all.
Chapter 18. As the Dirksen fleet prepared to set out for Pyrene, Castiel was careful not to let Sable know he was aware of her plans to trick him into siring children. When the new girl came to his room, he enthralled her and made her believe she had slept with him, and he remembered to rough her up a little to make the lie seem convincing. Sable Dirksen might have gotten one child out of him, but she would not get any more. Castiel's mind ranged across the various ways he might get his revenge on Sable Dirksen. He'd imagined killing her in a range of painful ways. He'd imagined imprisoning her and forcing her to bear his children, who he would then control. He'd imagined subjecting her to endless torture, but in the end he'd dismissed them all. For the time being he was only one mage. The power he wielded was not sufficient to defeat all the Dirksens who would defend their leader. Yet the incident with the servant girl had strengthened his resolve to do something. It was clear that Sable was only tolerating him, using him for her own ends. She had no intention of allowing him into the inner circle of influential, powerful Dirksens. He was not a significant figure, he was only a tool. One thing she hadn't considered, however, was the fact that mages had to be trained. When he'd explained to her that the ability was passed from parent to child, he'd skated over his mother's role in teaching the children. At the time, he'd been downplaying the fact because he wanted to make himself appear more impressive. But the omission had worked in his favour in a different way. Sable Dirksen could breed as many mage offspring as she liked, but they would be useless to her without proper training. Now he came to think of it, he wasn't sure he could train anyone else to be a mage, even if he wanted to. He had realised long ago his mother had been a poor teacher deliberately. He would do no better than her, and probably worse. He also had an inkling he would lose his talent over time if he didn't practice other things, but he wasn't clear on what they were. So he had two problems. Sable Dirksen intended on dispensing with him in one way or another eventually, and he needed proper training if he was not to lose his powers. The answer to both these problems was a single person, Carina. Of all his siblings, she was the only one who had been properly trained. Carina really knew what she was talking about, and she could teach him to be more powerful. So powerful he could foil Sable's plans to use him for her own ends. And if he caught Carina, he would have his brothers and sisters too. That would make 6 mages. With a force as strong as that, he wouldn't need Sherers or Dirksens. He could build an empire large and powerful enough to take on and defeat both clans. That was what he had to do. Finding and capturing his siblings had to be his top priority. Luckily for him, Sable's plans were dovetailing into his own. The day after he had enthralled the servant girl and discovered Sable's scheme, Castiel descended the stairs to the great hall in a positive mood. Tiredness stalked him after his long night of worry, but he mentally brushed aside the small discomfort. For the first time since arriving at the mountain castle, he finally felt like he knew exactly where he stood and what he needed to do. "You seem cheerful this morning," Sable commented as he sat down at the dining table. Key was also here. Had he spent the previous night with Sable? For once, Castiel experienced no twinge of jealousy. He no longer wanted the small thing that remained for Sable to offer him. He would not sully himself with an intimate relationship with the snake. "I am cheerful," Castiel replied. "My latest servant is a very pretty, willing young woman. I appreciate you finding her for me after the previous one left so suddenly." He couldn't resist playing along with Sable's plan in order to see her reaction. If Commander Key was aware of Sable's scheme, he gave no sign of it after hearing Castiel's response. The man ignored him as he always did, unless speaking directly to him. Sable was a master of subterfuge, as she, too, didn't do anything other than smile indulgently at his comment. She wouldn't be smiling for much longer. The day finally came when the fleet was ready, and Castiel and Sable went together to the shuttle that would fly them up to the battle cruiser Elsinore. No one knew what they would encounter at Pyrene. Perhaps the Dirksons would have a long search on their hands to find Carina and the rest of his siblings. Whatever they might encounter, Sable and Key had tried to prepare for all eventualities. All Castiel had to take care of for the trip was his elixir supply. When he'd been aboard the Nightfall, his father had brought along a tank of the stuff. Mindful of the fact that he might be involved in a protracted battle, Castiel had made similar preparations. Yet he had insisted on bringing along a supply of ingredients too. The thought of the impending journey had made him painfully aware that without elixir he was helpless. He didn't even know how to fire a weapon. Elsinore was a very different ship from Nightfall. The passageways were narrower, and the bridge held only Key as commander of the vessel, the pilot, navigator, and comms and weapons officers. No signs stated the function of each room or section. The crew were expected to know. When Castiel had wandered onto the bridge unwittingly, Key and the other officers glared at him in silence until he left. A low-ranking crew member had shown Castiel to his cabin after he disembarked the shuttle. The room was a far cry from the suite his family had been assigned on the Nightfall. It was small and contained no private bathroom. He would be forced to use the communal restroom facilities for that section. As if that wasn't bad enough, his bed was one of two, and the crew member who had shown him the place told him not to stow his luggage on the other bunk because someone else would be using it. Who his bunkmate might be, Castiel had no idea, but whoever it was unconscionable that he had to share at all. But he didn't know what he could do about it. Like it or not, he needed these people for the moment. All he could do was bide his time and plot his revenge for the many insults that had been piled upon him. Worse still, there wasn't enough space to accommodate the tank of elixir he'd brought along. The container would have to be stowed in the galley, along with ingredients for cooking. The taste of elixir was disgusting, so it was unlikely the liquid would end up in a stew, but nevertheless, the fact that it wasn't near to hand made Castiel extremely uncomfortable. After accidentally walking onto the bridge, he had returned to his room. Or rather, he tried to return. He had already lost his bearings in the passageways of the large ship. Everywhere seemed to look the same, though he guessed there were subtle differences and clues that were unknown to him. His wanderings resulted in giving him an informal tour of the Elsinore. From the mess to the briefing room, he got to know the ship pretty well. He even happened upon Sable's quarters when he spotted her leaving a room. He caught a glimpse of the interior, which was substantially larger and more luxurious than his own. He wondered who would be lining up outside the room the next quiet shift, and whether the Dirkson leader would manage to work her way through the entire crew before they reached Pyrene. When he finally found his cabin again, he was irked to see someone lying in the top bunk. He'd left a bag on the bed to claim it, and the person had moved the bag to the bottom bunk. Rhys Dirkson's hateful visage confronted him. He would be forced to spend weeks cooped up with one of the most loathsome people on Ostalon. Rhys didn't look surprised to see him. He only smirked and lay down again. So Rhys had been given the information about his bunkmate while Castiel had been kept in the dark. Had Sable Dirksen deliberately put them together to make it easier for Rhys to spy on him? Castiel sat on the lower bunk, weighing his options. Rhys's move to secure the top bunk was obviously a ploy to signal his dominance. Castiel couldn't allow the step to go unchallenged, but he was unsure of what to do. Hate him as he might, Rhys was older, taller, and stronger. He couldn't physically remove him from the bunk. As much as Castiel hated to admit it, Rhys was pretty smart. He doubted he could trick him into giving up the superior sleeping place. All he had as an advantage was casting. That was going to be the only thing he could use to force Rhys out of his bed and show him who was boss. He went through a mental list of the casts he knew. Transport, locate, enthrall, rise, fire, heal, clear, break, lock, repulse, send and open were the ones he had practiced often. And there was split too, but he didn't think the Dirksens would take kindly to him using split on Rhys, satisfying though it might be. They would soon put an end to his affiliation with them through ending his life, mage or not. No, he needed to do something effective but that wouldn't cause long-term damage. He made his choice, sipped elixir, and began to cast. He opened his eyes and waited for Rhys's response. It wasn't long coming. "Hey!" resounded an angry shout from above. "Put me down!" Castiel watched with amusement as Rhys floated out from his bunk and across the narrow ceiling. He was twisting and writhing, ineffectively fighting the cast. "I said, put me down!" Rhys reiterated furiously. "Are you sure about that?" Castiel asked. He glanced at the floor and back up toward Rhys. "Looks like a nasty drop to me, but if you insist..." Rhys, realizing what would happen if Castiel did as he'd asked, said, "Put me back on my bunk, I mean, you moron!" "Those are brave words for someone floating helplessly in my grasp. I'd like an apology." Rhys only glared at him. Then he cast a look at the floor, as if judging how much he would be hurt by falling the distance. "Go on, drop me. I promise I'll hurt you more than it'll hurt me." Castiel sat up. He'd had enough of Rhys. He'd had enough of all the Dirksens. If they thought they were going to walk all over him, they had another think coming. He would start with Langley Dirksen's son. "Believe me, I can hurt you even more than you imagine. Did you hear what I did to the Shura Admiral? I tore her in two. She died screaming in agony." He watched Rhys's expression as he registered this fact. He had heard, Castiel could tell. His bravado had begun to weaken. "And don't think I won't do it," said Castiel. "Just because I can't do it now, it doesn't mean I won't do it at some later date, when I have the power and influence to put a stop to anyone who might want to avenge your life. So you better watch out, Rhys Dirksen. You piss me off, and I won't ever forget it." Castiel released him, and he hit the floor hard. Rhys yelled in pain and anger, but Castiel's threat had taken effect. Rhys didn't retaliate, and when Castiel climbed up to the top bunk, he didn't respond. The Dirksen youth sat on the floor for a moment before getting up and slamming out of the cabin. There was blood on the bare metal. Castiel smiled. He must have broken the idiot's nose. He hoped it would serve as a warning to him and to all the other Dirksens. They might treat him like nothing but a tool to be used, but he would remember it. He would note who showed him favour and who disrespected him, and when the time came, they would pay. Chapter 19. Darius had returned to the tent after another long day spent with the spirit mage. Dinner had already been eaten, but Carina had saved some for him. While the others went out to the natural spring at the camp centre to wash away the dirt and dust accumulated during the day, she sat with her sleepy brother, encouraging him to eat more before he went to bed. He did force down a few more mouthfuls before his eyelids drooped and his head nodded. Bryce picked up the little boy and carried him to his sleeping spot at the edge of the large tent. "He can't go on like this," she said after Bryce returned to her side. They sat outside the open tent flap, watching the evening bustle of the camp. She wasn't worried about Darius overhearing her. He would be dead to the world until morning, when he would rise and wearily set out for the spirit mage's tent again.
"It does seem excessive work for a young kid," Bryce said. "Have you spoken to Justin or Ira about it?"
"I haven't seen Ira for days. I think she leaves every so often to ferry in new arrivals as a way of avoiding attracting too much attention. I did speak to Justin, but he only said that learning from the spirit mage was Darius's destiny. No other spirit mage has appeared in decades, and it's vital that Magda passes on as much knowledge as she can to Darius before she dies. But he's just a little boy." She understood the older mage's perspective. Without a spirit mage, there could be no matching, and with no matching, the mages and their culture would eventually die out. Yet it seemed wrong to place all that responsibility on the shoulders of a 6-year-old.
"I don't know what to say," said Bryce. "It's mage business."
She rubbed her temples. She didn't know what to do for the best. After spending so many years cut off from her mage kindred, she knew little more than Bryce did. "How have the other mages been treating you and Nala?" she asked. In her preoccupation with Darius and the novelty of living among hundreds of mages, she had forgotten that her friend's experience would be very different from her own.
"I'm not sure they know we aren't mages. I haven't told anyone, and Nala has no reason to either. For once, mage reluctance to tell anyone anything is working out for us."
She smiled. "But, considering this is a matching, have you been approached?" She raised her eyebrows in mock curiosity.
"Maybe. How about you?"
I have far too much going on to think about things like that."
"I think the ones I know already are enough trouble."
She laughed, but then she grew somber. There was one mage who was more than enough trouble for everyone, Castiel. All the mages that, as far as Carina could tell, were in charge, knew about her half-brother, but no one had mentioned what should be done about him. Would the responsibility fall to her? And if it did, should she do anything? The more time she spent at the matching, the more distant the problem of a dark mage had become. She wouldn't need much persuasion to abandon the difficult, dangerous task of putting a stop to his activities. The next day, Carina was walking through the camp and she happened to pass by the spirit mage's tent. She was debating whether to go inside and ask to speak to the old woman about Darius, and perhaps about Castiel too, when, to her surprise, Magda poked her head through the open flap. "Carina, please come in for a moment," she said, before withdrawing into her tent. Reluctantly, Carina lifted the flap and went inside. It was the first time she'd seen the interior of Magda's tent. The floor was spread with rugs and utensils, lamps and ornaments hung from the struts. 2 full bags made of thick embroidered cloth sat in one corner. The spirit mage also had a decorative decanter full of elixir and a couple of beakers. "Darius isn't here?" Carina asked. "I sent him home early. The child was tired. Perhaps I have been pushing him too hard." "Perhaps you have," said Carina, trying but failing to keep an accusatory tone out of her voice. "You care about him very much, don't you?" "Of course I do. He's my brother." "And he's also the only spirit mage who has come forward. I know I'm asking a lot of him, Carina, but I have little time left in which to teach him." The old woman appeared suddenly frail and ancient, and Carina felt a pang of pity, yet her sympathies remained with her brother. "Sit down, dear." Carina didn't sit. She remained standing, stooped under the tent's low roof. "What do you want to talk to me about?" Magda, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, reached up and took Carina's hand in her own. "I feel your presence whenever you walk past my tent. You are full of pain. You are radiating hurt. I think you bear the most suffering of anyone in this camp. I'm surprised Darius can tolerate being around you for long. I want to help you if I can." Magda's words surprised Carina. She had never imagined her presence might bring her brother discomfort. The knowledge hardened her bitterness. "I don't think there's anything you can do to help me, unless you can change the past." "No one can do that, but sometimes it helps to explore it, accept it, and move on." "You think I should accept everything that's happened?" Carina remained stubbornly standing. "How's that going to help me?" "Please sit. I want to tell you about Faye and Chris." The mention of her parents' names broke through Carina's defenses. Her resolve not to open herself up to this woman quavered. She lowered herself to her knees. "What do you want to tell me about them?" "Or perhaps it would be better if I showed your parents to you." "Showed them to me? How?" Mages could not keep images or recordings of each other. Everyone knew that. "Spirit mages do not only remember stories. One thing I have been teaching your brother is how to memorize what he sees. When he is older and I am dead, he will be able to pass on these images. It's the only way we have of keeping a record of our kind. Carina, I was at the matching where your parents met. I remember them. Would you like to see them?" Was there anything in the galaxy Carina wanted more than to see her parents again? Perhaps, but not many things. She would give a lot to see them as they had been when they were young and before harm had come to them. "Yes, I would." "Good. Close your eyes. I will send my memories to you. It may take some time, so please have patience." Carina did as the woman asked. Outside, the carefree sounds of the camp continued. She could hear people talking and laughing. In the distance, musical instruments played and people sang along. Someone had started a fire and she could hear it crackling. Faint smells of food cooking invaded the tent, but she saw only darkness until she saw them. The setting was the same. She could see the camp and the people, almost identical to the present, but the scene must have been more than 20 years previously. Ma and Ba were walking through the long grass at the edge of the camp, just talking, but the look of love that passed between them was so strong it was almost palpable. Ma looked exactly how Carina remembered her as a child, but more distinct and real. Her face was fresh and plump, not thin and sallow as it had been after years of torture from Stefan Scherer. Ba was a young, strong man, maybe not as handsome or strong-looking as some, but his expression was honest and kind. It was too much. Instead of bringing her joy, the sight opened wounds deep inside Carina, wounds that had festered under scars she had forced herself to grow. The image of her parents so young and innocent, so full of love and happiness, so unaware of the horrors that lay in their future, caused her almost unbearable agony. Her eyes snapped open. "Stop! Stop it!" She leapt up, knocking her head against a hanging cooking pot, and ran out of the tent. Momentarily blinded by the strong sunlight and confused by her emotional state, she paused. Then she set off through the camp, hardly knowing where she was going. What had Magda been thinking? She was either an idiot or a sadist. Carina couldn't understand why the old woman would subject her to something so painful. She had made everything worse, not better. She strode on, unheeding of the glances of the young mages, until she found she had somehow made her way back to her own tent. She stumbled inside. The place was dark and quiet. Only Bryce was there, stretched out and snoozing. Carina's entrance woke him.
Hey, what's...
Where's Darius? Magda said she'd sent him back because he looked tired.
He's gone to play on the prairie. I guess he missed his brothers and sisters more than sleep.
When she realized Bryce was alone in the tent and the children were not around, she turned and fastened the entrance.
What are you doing?
She had gone over to Bryce. He sat up. Welcoming the news they would be alone for a while, she kissed him hard on the mouth. For a moment, Bryce was too shocked to respond, but then he kissed her back and pulled her close. She remembered the first night they'd met on Ithia. Bryce had kissed her then. She hadn't forgotten what a good kisser he was. As they held each other tightly, her pain began to lose its edge. She needed to push it all away, push the hurt back down where it belonged. But then Bryce stopped kissing her. He looked into her surprised eyes and then disengaged himself from their embrace. He gripped her arms, holding her distant from him.
Carina, what is this? What's going on?
What? Nothing's going on. Let's do it. She leaned in to kiss him again, but Bryce moved his head backward. He gave her a strange look.
Has something happened? Something's wrong, isn't it? This isn't like you.
She could feel her cheeks turning scarlet. I don't know what you're talking about. She tried to kiss him again, but he turned away.
Carina,
For star's sake, do I have to put in a request? Bryce was shaking his head.
Something's rattled you, I can tell. Is this what you used to do with your merc buddies to get over your feelings when you were upset?
His tone was challenging. She moved away from him, blinking away tears, shame tingling every fibre of her being. How dare you? If you don't want me, that's fine. Only I got a different impression.
I'm sorry, that didn't come out how I meant it.
But she was already leaving. She couldn't bear the embarrassment. How would she look Bryce in the eye now?
Please don't go. It's just that it wouldn't be right for our first time. Not like this. Not because you're hurting. I don't want it to be.
She didn't hear any more. She was outside the tent and walking away. She left the camp by the quickest route and marched onto the prairie. She continued walking long kilometers into the evening and the night. She didn't return until the pale grey pre-dawn light suffused the sky. The camp was quiet and everyone was asleep. Chapter 20. Castiel hated travelling aboard a starship. He hated the claustrophobic conditions and the inconvenience. He also hated all his travelling companions, Commander Key and his crew, the troops on board, Sable Dirksen, another clan member called Barrett, and most of all, Rhys. Castiel figured that Sable had made them bunkmates so Rhys could spy on him. Though he'd put Rhys in his place by ousting him from the top bunk, Castiel was at a loss about what else he could do against the smug upstart. His position remained uncertain and shaky. Sable could use him, but he was not indispensable. To improve his position, he needed people he could directly control. Until then, he didn't want to risk the disfavour of the Dirksens. Providing he did their bidding, they would tolerate him as an ally, perhaps. As soon as he stepped out of line, his days would be numbered. Since the incident when he had dropped Rhys on his face, the two roommates hadn't spoken a word to each other, which was exactly how he liked it. However, it was clear that Rhys was well liked by everyone aboard the vessel. He had plenty of social interactions, while no one spoke a word more than was necessary to Castiel. Mealtimes were the worst. Sable sat with Key, Barrett, Rees and a couple of high-ranking officers. He was not invited to sit at the same table, and Sable had given him an icy stare the first time he'd tried. When he sat at the tables for the rest of the crew, no one sat with him. As the weeks had worn on, his anger at this unsubtle ostracization had grown. The final straw came when he returned to his cabin at the beginning of the quiet shift to find that Rees had once more occupied the top bunk. He could hardly believe the older boy's audacity and stupidity. Didn't he know he was about to end up face down on the floor again, only thrown, not dropped this time? "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he exclaimed. "Get down from there! That's my bed, and you know it." Rees leaned over the edge of the bunk and glared at him. "Make me." "All right, I will. You asked for it." Castiel took out his elixir bottle. He wondered how hard he could throw Rees without any retribution from Sable. Then fury seized him. He was sick and tired of everyone's treatment of him. He would throw Rees from the ceiling to the floor and perhaps bounce him around the cabin with some transport casts. Maybe he would stop short of actually killing him. He didn't care what Sable said or did. He had enough elixir to inflict some serious damage on someone before anyone could stop him, come what may. Rees was watching him. Castiel took a swig from his canister without breaking eye contact with the Dirksen brat. When the liquid hit his tongue, he spat it out in surprise. The taste was wrong. It wasn't elixir. He took another sip. The liquid was plain water. He stared at the canister. How had they managed to switch the contents? He kept it by his side all the time. Rees was laughing. "I wish you could see your face. It's quite the picture." His laugh faded and his expression grew malevolent. "Not so cocky now, huh?" Fear began to creep up on Castiel. Without his elixir, he felt naked and very vulnerable. He turned to leave, but there came the sound of movement behind him. A heavy weight landed on his back. Rees had jumped onto him. His face hit the door. He heard the crunch of his nose breaking. Agony stabbed at him, and hot blood gushed out. He yelled. Rees's impact had forced him to the deck. 2 hands grabbed his hair and lifted his head before slamming it into the floor again and again. Rees was yelling at him. "You're nothing but a traitor, Castiel Shura, betraying your own kind. Your sister isn't even a Shura, but she refused to help us. She had some honor. You're nothing but a slime ball, a turd, a faithless, disloyal, two-faced toad." Finally, the banging of his head on the floor stopped. Rees climbed off his back. Castiel heard him stand, and then Rees's boot thudded into his side, and pain erupted again. Rees kicked him 3 or 4 more times. He moved away, and the door opened. "You'll be given your potion when we want you to use it," said Rees. "And if you use it on one of us again, we'll kill you." The door closed. Castiel lay still. The blood from his nose had formed a lukewarm, sticky pool around his face. He had never hurt so much in his life. His head throbbed. It felt like Rees was still banging it on the floor. His side ached where Rees's boot had landed. He fought the urge to cry even more. He would not shed tears like a baby. He was a man, and he would behave like one. That was what Father would have wanted. In time, he found the strength to sit up, though he didn't want to move from the floor. He sat in his blood and brooded on his pain and hurt. He would never forget this moment. He had tried to help the Dirksens. All he'd desired had been to progress to his rightful place at the head of the clan. If they'd allowed him that, they could all have benefited. But instead the clan had chosen to use him like he was nothing. They wanted what he had to offer, but they refused to give anything back, not even the recognition he was owed. So be it. He had played along, and so he would continue, for exactly as long as it suited him. Then they would all pay, and pay dearly. As if Rhys's attack had been a trigger, Castiel noticed a deepening in the coldness he experienced from everyone aboard the ship. He was not confined to his cabin, as he'd suspected might happen, but no one spoke a word to him. No one looked at him. If he didn't move aside in the passageways, the crew would walk right into him. It was like he was invisible, a ghost who didn't know he was dead yet. The supply of elixir he'd brought aboard the ship had predictably disappeared from the galley. When he asked the cook where it was, the man had looked through him as though he wasn't there. He guessed the liquid would reappear when they arrived at Pyrene, but he wasn't even sure of that. As he drifted about the ship while the seemingly endless journey dragged on, Castiel wondered why, if he was no longer considered an ally, only someone to be used, the Dirksons hadn't put him in the brig. When the answer to this puzzle hit him, his cheeks turned fiery red with anger and shame. The reason the Dirksons hadn't locked him up wasn't due to fear of retribution, but the exact opposite. They didn't fear him at all. They hadn't confined him because they couldn't be bothered. This new understanding hit hard, and it was as much as Castiel could do not to take a knife and murder Sable Dirkson. The attention she had shown him, scant as it was, had all been a sham. She'd only been playing with him, drawing as much information from him as she could. Now that she had what she wanted, all pretense was gone. Fanciful ideas of revenge Castiel had formed previously devolved into a simmering black hatred, not only of the Dirksons, but of everyone else who had disrespected him over the years. He hated all of humanity, in fact. The only person who had ever treated him as he deserved was Father, and he was dead. Castiel decided he would never show mercy to any human being. Then the announcement came. The Elsinore had arrived at Pyrene. Chapter 21. Carina's experience of the matching had turned from pleasure to bitter unhappiness. Her friendship with Bryce was ruined, Parthenia still hated her, and the spirit mage seemed intent on overwhelming Darius with knowledge. The old woman seemed to cause her nothing but heartache. Though Darius's admiration and almost hero worship of her had been over the top and unwarranted, Carina had been touched by it. The news that her presence caused her beloved brother pain had come as a shock, and she didn't know how to deal with it. The only saving graces of her family's current situation were that Oriana and Fern were finally truly happy, and that Nala was coming out of her shell. Her little personality was blossoming, and it warmed Carina's heart to see it. The girl had spent so long in Castiel's shadow and following around at his heels, Carina had feared she would never get over it. But the kindness of Oriana and Fern, along with the young mages at the camp, had paid off. Nala no longer spoke in whispers or hung back from joining in activities. If only Carina could similarly blossom. Though she was younger than many of the men and women at the matching, she felt older and battle-worn, and she didn't know if she would ever be fixed. Various young men had approached her over the weeks in subtle but unmistakable ways. Carina had equally subtly rejected their advances. She was in no mood for love, and she had alienated the one person she might have considered in that way through her clumsy proposition. What was it Bryce had asked her during that shameful moment? Something about resorting to doing that with her fellow mercs when something upset her? She hadn't thought about it, but maybe he had a point. Having nothing better to do one evening, Carina decided to listen to another of the Spirit Mage's stories. Darius and Nala were already asleep, and Oriana and Fern agreed to look after them. Carina walked through the camp in the heavy twilight toward the large central fire where the Spirit Mage told her tales. The woman was sitting on the far side of the fire, so she could only hear her story, which had already begun. She sat cross-legged, rested an elbow on one knee and her chin on her palm, closed her eyes and began to listen. The dark mage had been working in secret. Her ears pricked up. This was the first story of a dark mage the Spirit Mage had told, as far as she knew. She listened more intently, hoping to hear something useful. When the story was over, despite the late hour, Carina decided to speak to the Spirit Mage before she returned to her tent. She had, if she was honest, all but given up on the idea of returning to Ostalon to try to find her mage half-brother and prevent him from exercising his powers for evil. But the Spirit Mage's story had forced her to reconsider. Perhaps mages did have a duty to protect the rest of humankind from the evil possibilities of casting. Carina caught up to the old woman. "I'd like to talk to you about what you said tonight, if you don't mind." "I don't mind at all. Did you enjoy the story?" "I don't know if enjoy is the right word to describe how I felt about it. Did you hear that I have a half-brother who I believe is a dark mage?" "I did. The Mage Council has decided to wait to see what eventuates before making a decision about what we should do." "The Mage Council?" "Ah," said Magda, putting a hand to her mouth. "I shouldn't have let that slip. I apologize. I'm getting old. Please don't ask me any more about what I said." It wasn't hard to guess the facts behind the old woman's slip-up. Justin, Jace, the Haihu's captain, and other older mages Carina had seen were clearly members of some organization involved in overseeing the activities of mages. Like most things in mage life, the council was secret. But one thing was clear. The Mage Council was not going to tackle Castiel, or at least not until he did something truly dreadful. If anyone was going to take away his ability to commit evil acts, it was down to his family. "I'm sorry that showing you the images of your parents upset you the other day," the old woman continued. "That wasn't my intention." "It's okay," Carina replied. "I understand now that you were trying to help. You couldn't have known the effect it would have. I didn't know it myself. And though it did make me unhappy at the time, I'm glad I have those memories now." The Spirit Mage reached out to Carina's forearm and gripped it tightly. "I try to help, you see, but I don't always succeed. I was only given the gift of feeling what others feel, but not the wisdom of how to make them feel better. It has been the labor of my life to learn that, but I was a poor student." Though Carina was no spirit mage, she sensed the woman's deep sorrow, and for the first time she saw things from her perspective. The woman had an unenviable responsibility. She carried thousands of years of mage lore in her mind, and it was her duty to pass that on as fully and faithfully as she could. If she failed, it would mean the loss of their history and everything that made them who they were. Carina had only seen her as someone who was taking Darius away and overloading his young mind. She had seen the toll it was taking on him. He was constantly fatigued and low-spirited, but the Spirit Mage was trying to save their clan before it was too late, and Darius was her only means of doing so. "I'm glad you don't hate me for what I did, though I don't think that after this matching we will part as friends." "Huh? Why not?" Carina had a sudden sense of foreboding. "Please come inside so we can talk." They were at the old woman's tent. She lifted the flap to invite Carina to enter first and then followed her. The interior was dark, only the light from the dying campfire creating a glow through the wall. The woman lit a lamp and invited her to sit down. As she had done when she'd shown Carina her memory of her parents, the spirit mage sat opposite her and took Carina's hands in her own. "I wish you were older and one of Darius's parents, but you are the closest person he has to a parent now. Carina, there is no easy way to say this. I know how much Darius means to you." Carina's stomach tightened. What was the woman going to say? "When the matching is over, Darius must come with me." Carina snatched her hands away. "No way! Absolutely not! He's far too young. He needs to be with the family he has left. He needs to be with me." The spirit mage's eyes were sad. "I guessed that would be how you would feel. Nevertheless nothing. You're right. I am the closest thing Darius has to a parent. I have the final say over what he does and where he goes. And I don't give permission for you to take him anywhere. He's 6 years old, for Star's sake. He's much too young to leave his family." Despite her words, Carina was deeply conflicted. Keeping Darius by her side meant he would be subjected to her emotional pain. "He is very young," said the mage, "but he will be well cared for. Carina, please listen to me. This is unavoidable. Justin and all the others agree. The work I've done with Darius so far is only the beginning of what I must teach him. If I were only to see him at matchings, it would take decades to impart everything he must learn, and I have so little time left. He has to live with me so he can study every day. The future of our kind depends on it." "I don't care. He's just a little boy. It's too much to ask of him. It isn't fair." "I agree. It isn't fair. And yet that's the situation we find ourselves in. Such is the lot of mages. We sacrifice so much in order to keep our heritage continuing." "Then maybe it's time to give up." The spirit mage had been looking downward, but at this she raised her head. "You mean give up being mages?" "Maybe we should. Maybe it's the only sensible thing to do. Ma told me once it was only because someone stumbled upon the secret of our abilities millennia ago that we realized we weren't the same as other people. If we give up, we'll only go back to being like everyone else. No running, no hiding, no persecution, torture, and rape. Did you hear what my mother went through?" "No, I didn't, but I know. It's written on your heart." Carina's eyes stung. "And my father, murdered, all because they wanted to use their powers to help people. Now you're telling me you have to rip a little boy away from his family so he can help keep magehood alive. Why? What's the point? We don't use our abilities to improve humankind. We only use them to help ourselves, in secret. We live our lives in fear. Maybe it's time to call it a day, right now." She stood up, crouching under the low ceiling. "You're right. I am the person who is responsible for Darius, and I say no. He isn't going anywhere with you. He's coming with us. In fact, I don't even know why we're here. I'm not interested in matching with anyone, and all my brothers and sisters are too young. We'll be leaving in the morning." She left the tent without looking back. She was furious. How dare the old witch think she could just take Darius away for her own ends? He wasn't a sack of flour to be carted around, passed to whoever wanted him. When she arrived at her tent, everyone was asleep. In the dim light, Carina surveyed the low black humps that represented everyone she cared about. No one was going to take any of them away from her, and she would kill anyone who tried. She had already lost 3 of the most important people in her life and endured years of isolation and loneliness. She wasn't going to lose anyone else. She tiptoed between the sleeping forms to reach her spot and slipped under her blanket. She was settling down, her mind still whirling from her conversation with the spirit mage, when someone gently grasped her foot. It was Bryce, who slept along from her.
"Everything okay?"
he whispered. She was too choked up to answer. She silently shook her head, though she doubted Bryce could see the gesture. A moment later she heard him leave his spot and crawl over. He lay down opposite her. She couldn't see much more of him than the glint of his eyes in the darkness. His proximity brought back the vivid memory of her failed seduction, and her face became hot. She was glad he couldn't see her.
"What's up?"
he murmured. "The mages want Darius to leave us and go with the spirit mage when the matching is over."
"You're kidding."
"I wish I was."
"You aren't going to let them take him, right?"
"Of course not. But that means we have to leave tomorrow, early."
"Okay, that's what we'll do. I'm not sure how far the closest city is, but we can make it there."
"What if they try to stop us?" She didn't know how the Mage Council would react, and, stupidly, in her anger she'd announced her intention. There would be no slipping away quietly while no one was looking. She didn't relish the idea of fighting off 1,000 mages in order to leave, even with Darius's exceptional ability on their side.
"I don't think they will. They'll probably only try to argue you out of it. But I doubt they'll try to stop you physically. Mages seem to be gentle, non-confrontational people."
"I wouldn't be too sure about that. I wouldn't have survived long as a merc by being gentle and non-confrontational." A pause stretched out. "Bryce," he kissed her.
"It's okay."
The following day, the news they were going to leave the matching didn't go down well among Carina's brothers and sisters, with one exception. After Carina made the announcement, Parthenia said, "So we're finally going back to Ostalon to deal with Castiel?" "I think so," said Carina. Maybe she'd been wrong all along. If the matching had taught her anything, it was that her family should stick together and take care of their own, whether that meant a small boy's welfare or preventing his elder brother from committing terrible acts. "Great! At last! But don't I have to stay with the spirit mage?" asked Darius. "No, not any longer," Carina replied. "You've spent enough time with her already." As she spoke, knots of anxiety formed in her stomach. Was she doing the right thing? She just didn't know. Nothing seemed right, but if one thing was for sure, her family was not going to be split up again. Oriana and Fern looked glum, but didn't say anything. Nala began to pack their few belongings. "How are we going to leave?" Darius asked. It was a good point. They had arrived via the Haihu shuttle. Even if the mages agreed to their leaving, Carina doubted they would give them a ride to the nearest spaceport. She didn't know how the other people at the camp had travelled here, or where the nearest city was. Perhaps leaving the matching wouldn't be so easy after all. The tent flap was open, and the morning sunlight was suddenly cut off as a large figure appeared in the entrance. The children stopped their packing, but the newcomer's expression registered that he understood what was happening.
"The spirit mage sent to me when I woke up. She told me you might be leaving. I see that you are."
His tone was neutral. Carina couldn't guess what he thought of her decision, or if he would try to stop them. She sized him up. Though he was far larger than her, she might be able to take him if he didn't know how to fight. "That's right," she replied. "I'm not prepared to let Darius go with the spirit mage."
"I understand. Is it okay if I can come in so we can talk?"
"I guess so," Carina said warily. "But I'm warning you, if you try to stop us, you'll regret it." Jace halted as he entered the tent, stooping low, and looked Carina in the eyes.
"It seems you haven't learned much about mages in your time here."
He sat down and continued,
"Have you considered that you could also live on the spirit mage's world and see Darius whenever you wanted to?"
Carina felt suddenly foolish. No, I hadn't considered that. But he's too young to be trained in this way. The fate of all mages is too heavy a burden to place on the shoulders of a young child. Besides, we have other work to do. We must find our dark mage brother and stop him from hurting anyone.
So you don't want Darius to live with an old lady in safety on a backwater planet, but you're happy to take him into conflict with a dark mage?
The way Jace put it made Carina think again, but she quickly came to the same decision. I know how it sounds, but I will keep Darius safe, and the rest of the younger children too. You have to understand that we're a family. We have our own path to follow. And though you say the spirit mage lives on a safe backwater planet, that's exactly what Ostalon was before the Dirksons decided to make it their base. The same with my home planet, safe, boring and dirt poor. But that didn't stop Regians from paying us a visit and starting a massacre. Nowhere in this galactic sector is safe with a dark mage running loose. Castiel is our brother, and it's up to us to neutralize him. Then we can leave the Sherras and Dirksons to continue their feud while we search for Earth. She took a breath. There, she'd said it, crazy as it sounded. Jace's eyebrows rose.
You have it all figured out, don't you?
His words sounded mocking, but his intonation was serious.
If that's your wish, no one here will stop you.
You won't? She found it hard to believe he would give in so easily. But the spirit mage was telling me it's vital Darius is trained by her. She seemed to think the future of mage lore depended on it.
She may well be correct. On the other hand, perhaps another spirit mage will appear. Maybe someone older than Darius who has been lost or delayed. Who knows what might happen, but I am convinced your intention is sincere and you are capable of protecting those in your charge. It is clear you would give your life before you allowed them to come to harm. In any case, you have always been free to leave whenever you wanted. It would go against everything we stand for to keep you here by force.
Relief washed over Carina. She wouldn't have to fight Jace. He was a good man, and she would have regretted it.
Do you have a plan for reaching the city?
He asked. Not exactly. I thought we would have to walk there.
You aren't well equipped for that. I will wait outside while you finish packing, then I'll take you to your transportation.
It didn't take them long to pack. They had the clothes they'd been wearing when they arrived, plus a few donated belongings. Nala had been given a doll made from dried grass that she treated as the most precious thing she'd ever owned. Her attachment to the toy was odd, considering all the valuable things she must have been given in her former life. When they were ready, they stepped out into the sunlight. A pile of full cloth bags had appeared beside their tent. "Who do they belong to?" asked Oriana.
"They're all of yours," Jace replied. "Word has gotten around that you're leaving. People know you have nothing, so they wanted to help you out."
Carina's throat felt thick and her eyes stung. "Even though we're taking away the next spirit mage?"
"Even so,"
said Jace. Her surprise and gratitude almost made her change her mind about leaving, but she was convinced she was doing the right thing. She spotted the edges of weapon butts poking out of a bulky bag. "Are those guns?"
"The city isn't well policed. Those are for your protection, but I wouldn't go flashing them around if I were you. There's no sense in inviting trouble."
"I understand. Please give everyone our thanks."
"I will, but they don't need it. They're only doing the same for you as they would for any fellow mage. That's one reason we have survived for so long, I believe. We always help each other. Are you ready?"
"Yes, let's go." Carina told the others to take a bag and picked up the weapons bag herself. The heavy weight of steel was comforting and familiar. She felt a whole lot safer when armed. "Oh, we have lots of elixir," said Darius, opening a bag. "Good," Carina said. "Come on, everyone. The morning's passing and we have a long journey ahead." Jace led them through the camp, past the central fire pit, now black and faintly smoking, and into a section where Carina had never been. The young mages were rising, preparing their breakfasts and talking. The scene was one she had seen many times, but now she realized she might be seeing it for the last time. A pang of sadness hit her. Would she ever see her people gathered in such numbers again? She doubted it. A mage's life was a lonely one. All the more reason to keep her family close together.
"Do you think you'll ever be back?"
Bryce asked, as if he'd read her thoughts. "I don't think so."
"But what if you're summoned again?"
"Oh, I wouldn't go. What would be the point?" And with those words, Carina realized that at some point over the previous few days she had found herself already matched. Bryce held her gaze as they came to their mutual understanding, and then he nodded, satisfied. At the edge of the campsite stood Justin, the Haihu's captain, Ira, and the ship's hands Ren and Ione. "Are we taking the shuttle?" Carina asked.
"No,"
replied Jace.
"My brother and the ship's crew are here to help transport you all. We'll go to a location a few kilometers from the city, and then you can make your way in quietly. We try to attract as little attention as possible."
"You're coming too?"
"Of course. I will stay with you until I'm sure you are safe."
"Thank you."
"It's no problem. Are you all ready?"
As soon as it was clear they were all prepared to depart the camp, Justin and the other mages transported them. Chapter 22. Key was taking a landing party to Pyrene's largest city, Ulcerwell. Castiel was to accompany the group, and, worse still, Rhys was to be his minder. He was enjoying brandishing a weapon. Key addressed the team in the Elsinore shuttle bay. He had assembled 8 soldiers and 4 regular crew, as well as Castiel and Rhys. Barrett Dirksen was also coming along. Castiel had not figured out the man's role in the Dirksen clan. Slim, dark-skinned and black-haired, he dressed plainly but expensively as Sable did, though Castiel could not see an actual family resemblance. But his status was clear from Key's deference to him.
"There's no point in trying to hide who we are,"
said Key to the party.
"A battle cruiser in orbit is kind of hard to disguise, and as soon as we arrive at Ulcerwell spaceport, we'll be met with plenty of questions. But I'm sure I don't need to remind you that you are not to give away the true reason for our presence on Pyrene. If anyone asks what we're doing here, the answer you must give is that we're paying a diplomatic visit as a gesture of friendship from the Dirksen Federation."
So that's Barrett Dirksen's role, thought Castiel. The man was to play the diplomat, while Key got on with the real task of locating Carina and their brothers and sisters.
"Remember,"
Key continued,
"your role is to mingle with the local population. Ask about new arrivals on Pyrene, a group of 5 children and a young woman looking after them. This is a quiet place with a small population. Someone might have noticed them. Also ask about reports of odd happenings, things that cannot ordinarily happen."
"Permission to speak, sir," said a soldier.
"Yes, Corporal."
"Could you give us a few examples?" Key turned to Castiel.
"What do you suggest?"
Castiel was about to refuse to answer, but Rhys was one step ahead of him. He knocked the butt of his weapon into Castiel's soldier and said, "Tell him." A quiet fury had been simmering in Castiel for days, threatening to boil over, but he managed to keep a lid on it. "You might hear reports of people acting strangely, as if not under their own control, doors unlocking themselves, things moved by unseen hands, that kind of thing. Mages can also transport themselves from place to place, so you might hear of people suddenly disappearing or appearing, but we're usually very careful to never do that anywhere that it might be noticed, except when trying to escape. The moment he was allowed to get his hands on some elixir, that was Castiel's plan. He would cast transport and put as much distance between himself and Key, Rhys, and the rest of the landing party as he could. Pyrene might be the middle of nowhere in terms of significance in the galactic sector, but he would rather be stranded here than spend another minute under the control of the Dirksons. His experience of the last few days had taught him that all his plans had come to nothing. He had become a slave to the clan, to be treated the same as his father had treated his mother and his mage siblings. Yet he had not resigned himself to a sense of inevitability about his fate. He had only given up on relying on others to assign him the power that was fitting to his abilities. Now he knew that if he was to rise to prominence, he would have to do it alone. Only first he had to escape. His plan carried a certain level of risk. Rhys had delighted in telling him that Sable had given permission to shoot him the moment his actions became suspicious, such as if a cast took too long to work. But it was a risk he was willing to take. His situation was not the same as Mother's. He would not be abandoning anyone by transporting himself away or splitting up a family. He had no one he loved who would be tortured as punishment for his transgression. The Dirksons had less control over him than they thought, and if the right opportunity arrived, they were about to learn that fact. The landing party was walking up the ramp to enter the shuttle. "You too," Rhys said to Castiel, pushing him again with his weapon. "Enjoying yourself?" asked Castiel as he stepped onto the ramp. "As a matter of fact, I am," said Rhys, grinning. "It's a pain in the ass to have to hang around with a loser like you. I might as well get what I can out of it." "Don't think I'll forget this, Rhys Dirkson." "Oh, I'm sure you won't forget it. You'll just never be able to do anything about it." They walked into the shuttle's interior. Rhys made Castiel sit down in a seat at the back of the vessel. The rest of the party took their seats too, and Key went into the pilot's cabin. The shuttle doors didn't close, and after a few minutes, Castiel and everyone else was looking around, wondering what was causing the delay. Footsteps sounded on the shuttle's ramp, and Sable Dirkson entered. Despite his hatred of the head of the Dirkson clan, he was forced to admit she looked sublime. She was wearing a calf-length dress, heavily brocaded in threads made from precious metals. Iridescent gemstones studded the fabric, and the choker around her neck seemed to be made from the shell of a rare mollusk. He remembered his father giving his mother a hair comb made from the same extremely expensive material, and flying into a rage when she wasn't delighted with her gift. "Don't look at her," Rhys hissed. "You aren't fit to kiss her feet." Castiel saw the look in his guard's eyes and recognized his own lust and covetousness towards Sable Dirkson. He smirked. The chances of Rhys Dirkson possessing her were probably little better than his own. Sable passed them by without a glance and disappeared into the pilot's cabin. The shuttle doors closed and the vessel took off. So Sable had decided she would also form part of the diplomatic mission to Pyrene. Perhaps she wanted to be on hand if and when his mage siblings were captured. He doubted that would actually happen. There was no guarantee they had ever come to Pyrene, and if they had, Carina was smart enough to keep them all hidden. Sable would not remain on Pyrene forever. Eventually she would have to concede defeat and depart. These combined realizations made his heart sink. If no sign of mages could be found on the planet, it was unlikely he would be called upon to cast. He would never be allowed access to elixir, and he would never have the opportunity to escape. He would remain a prisoner indefinitely. Perhaps Sable would never require him to cast. Perhaps she would take him back to Ostalon and lock him away in a cell deep under the mountain castle, along with Calverley. If he were in Sable's position, that is probably what he would do. She had spoken of mages as threats and liabilities, and, after all, at the end of the day, he would always be a Shura. "Thinking about what you're going to do to find your sister?" asked Rhys, leaning uncomfortably into Castiel's shoulder. He didn't deign to answer. "I would if I were you," said Rhys. "If I were you," he repeated, "I would make myself as useful as possible. Otherwise we might see no reason for keeping you alive." Castiel stared doggedly ahead at the seat back in front of him. Would the Dirksons actually execute him? He hadn't considered that. The notion that someone would or could put an end to his life was too detestable to contemplate. Yet now Rhys had brought up the possibility, he could not exclude it. His resolve to escape the Dirksons at the earliest opportunity became even more urgent. Remaining under their control was a constant threat to his liberty and his life. The shuttle was touching down in Ulcerwell spaceport, and Sable and Key emerged from the pilot's cabin. Key began to address the troops and members of the Elsinore's crew. Sable walked directly to the back of the cabin where Rhys and Castiel sat. She was holding something in her hand. When Castiel recognized it, dismay coursed through him. "Rhys, put these on his wrist and your own." Rhys took the handcuffs and did as he'd been instructed, closing one band around his left wrist and one around Castiel's right. Sable gave Rhys a metal fob that Castiel assumed was the unlocking device. "You're both to accompany Key. Do whatever he says, and if Castiel tries to escape, shoot to kill, remember?" "Yes, ma'am." "I would rather have the filthy little traitor dead than working against us." Sable shot Castiel a glance filled with disgust before leaving them. "Not going far now, huh?" said Rhys, lifting his left arm. Castiel's right arm was dragged upward by the cuffs. Their appearance had certainly made things more difficult. If he managed to cast transport without being shot, Rhys would be coming along. Chapter 23. If it weren't for the city she could see in the distance, Carina would have thought she hadn't moved. They were surrounded by the high, tough grass of the prairie, except she could hear something else. "Oh no!" Parthenia blurted. "It's those horrible animals!" Carina turned to see what her sister was talking about. Several meters away, 30 or 40 large four-legged animals were enclosed by a fence. A dwelling stood next to the fence, along with a barn. The door opened and a middle-aged woman came out. "Are you talking about my horses, young lady?" asked the woman. "They aren't horrible." Parthenia flushed and looked at her feet.
"You'd better get used to them,"
said Jace, smiling.
"They're your transportation."
"Huh?" Carina asked. "How can they take us into the city?" "We have to sit on their backs," said Fern. "There were horses on Ostalon too. Didn't you ever see any? The first night we spent there, we slept in a barn that held horses. I think they're nice." "Do we have to use them?" asked Parthenia. Jace replied,
"There are no roads hereabouts. That's what helps to keep this place unnoticed. It's the safest route into the city for all of you. We can't risk people popping up out of nowhere all the time."
Carina sized up the creatures. She could see how it might be possible to sit on their backs, though it didn't look like it would be very comfortable. "So will the little ones sit with the grown-ups?" the woman asked Jace.
"Yes, that would be best."
"Okay. Can you give me a hand to saddle them up?" Jace left them to help the woman. "I'm not sure about this," said Parthenia. She addressed her comment to Carina. It was the first time she'd spoken normally to her sister since Carina had enthralled her. "It'll be all right," Carina replied. "I'm sure Jace wouldn't have brought us here otherwise." They stood and watched the woman catch and then attach some kind of harness to the animals and then put a seat on their backs. As she led the first horse over, the woman said, You don't have anything to be frightened of. I picked the quietest, gentlest ones. They're a bit slow, but they won't bolt or try to throw you off. This is Rainbow. Who wants her?" "I do," said Oriana. Her face was bright with excitement. "Step up here, then," the woman said, gesturing to a box next to the fence. When Oriana was in place, the woman led the horse over to her and explained how to climb onto it. Soon Oriana was sitting on the back of the beast, looking like she'd received the best birthday present ever. The woman taught her how to hold the straps that controlled the creature's head and told it which way to go. She also told her how gentle kicks would encourage it to go faster. "But you'll only be walking into town," the woman concluded. "The horses will follow Jace's naturally. You won't need to do much." While Carina had been watching Oriana, Jace had mounted one of the horses and walked it over.
"Jump up onto the step, Darius," he said. "You can ride in front of me."
A shadow of distrust passed over Carina's heart. Was Jace about to disappear with the precious new spirit mage? She caught Jace watching her expression. He gave a slight shake of his head as if rankled. Darius leapt onto the steps and allowed Jace to lift him onto the horse. He was beaming with pleasure, the same as Oriana. Soon they were all seated aboard the animals, their provisions slung over their shoulders. Jace thanked the woman and said goodbye. Carina noticed that he hadn't once spoken her name. He kicked his horse and rode to the front, heading out along a track worn through the grass. Carina's animal didn't need any direction from her. It followed Jace's without her guidance or urging. Parthenia looked scared and was holding on tightly, but Carina guessed she would be fine in time. The motion of the horse as it walked was soothing. "Do horses live on many planets in this region?" Fern asked Jace.
"Only 5 planets as far as I'm aware. I've heard that mages brought them on their colony ship when leaving Earth."
"I can't imagine these creatures living on a starship," said Carina.
"Perhaps they brought them in deep sleep."
Deep sleep was used to travel long distances that took months or years, such as when traveling out of the galactic sector. She had never been on a ship with that kind of equipment. "Do you think that's how mages first came to this region?"
"It's certainly possible. Sadly, we'll never know. That first ship must have rotted to dust thousands of years ago."
Carina got the sudden urge to talk more with the man. He would soon be leaving them, and she might never see him again. He probably knew more than most mages about their origins and that first journey. She gave her horse an experimental kick. The animal responded by moving a little faster. By trial and error, she finally found herself riding next to Jace. He glanced across at her with a quizzical but not displeased look. "Is it correct that mages were the first colonists of Ostalon?"
"That's generally thought to be the case. But how did you know?"
She told him about the religious scripture she'd read on the planet, which seemed to tell the story from the viewpoint of the second wave of colonists, who were regular humans.
Mage law relates that story a little differently, but that seems to be basically what happened. The mages tried to get along with the newcomers, but the new arrivals were too frightened of mage powers. It was the same as what happened on Earth. The mages were persecuted and driven into hiding. There's actually a place in the mountains not far from the capital that was their final refuge. Then it was decided the best course of action would be to split up and scatter to the stars, to live in secret and only meet at certain gatherings, like the matching.
"You mean there are other gatherings?"
"You know I can't tell you more, Carina."
"Okay, I understand. Sorry for asking, but..." Jace rolled his eyes. "Do you know the Ostalonians burn characters as a ritual?"
"I do. They also burn the map."
"Ah, of course." She recalled the moment in the temple when she'd seen a paper thrown into the ritual flames. The paper covered in dots.
"That's right. It's the map, and it has numbers too."
She sat upright in her saddle and swiveled to face him. "You're kidding!" There must be coordinates.
If they are, they're wrong.
How do you know?
Because people have travelled to them. They lead to empty space.
What people?
Mages who lived a long time before you or I. You aren't the first person to try to find their way back, you know. Earth is lost, Carina. You should forget about it.
Do you think the entire system was blown apart?
I think they would have found the remains of it if that were the case. But according to the stories, there was nothing. Either Earth never existed and our origin story is a myth, or the coordinates are wrong.
The conversation was such a revelation, Carina rode in silence for a while as she digested the information. I think the coordinates must be wrong. They were written so long ago, we no longer use the same system for mapping the galaxy.
Whatever the answer is, it means we can never go back. It would be impossible to find an unknown planet without correct coordinates. The galaxy is too vast to search.
But we know they came to Ostalon or a nearby planet first. That's a start.
We know nothing of the kind. It's all guesses. And anyway, if you did manage to find Earth, what are you imagining you'll find there? Mages left the place for a reason. What makes you think it's livable or will be welcomed back?
She didn't have good answers to the questions. I guess I would just like to see where my ancestors came from. And maybe I hope that things might have changed there in the intervening time. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a home where we could live without fear of torture and slavery?
Mages had that on Ostalon, and look what happened. It's the nature of humans to fear anyone different from themselves and to persecute them. Human nature will never change.
I used to think that too, but Bryce taught me differently. Jace's expression twisted as if he were uncomfortable.
There's an exception to every rule.
As they rode, the city drew nearer, and soon they reached the end of a street of cheap one-story houses and shacks that petered out onto the prairie.
This is where we part ways.
He halted his horse, and immediately the rest of the animals followed suit, except for Oriana's, which turned its head as if wanting to go home.
"Whoa there,"
Jace called at the animal, causing it to stop and shuffle restlessly on the dirt track.
"Don't try to get down yourselves,"
he said to the younger riders.
"Wait for me to help you."
Carina watched him dismount and then did the same herself as he lifted Darius down. Soon everyone was off their horses and waiting, while Jace tied a line between the animals to lead them home. When he was finally done, he strode to Carina and enveloped her in an unexpected hug. Though she wasn't a small woman, she felt crushed in the large man's embrace. He released her and thrust a packet into her hands.
"It's the local currency," he explained, "earned by honest means."
"But we can't accept—"
"We're mages. We help each other. One day you'll have the opportunity to help someone else. Now that money should pay for a few nights' lodging and food. Simple, low-paid work shouldn't be too hard to find. Good luck, Carina, and the rest of you. I hope our paths cross again someday."
Before she had the opportunity to answer, Jace had swung himself up onto his large horse and walked it away. They watched as the train of animals slowly departed. "It looks like that's it. Let's find somewhere to stay." Chapter 24. Castiel peered at the feed from the spy drone, amazed by what he saw. He was sitting in a room at the hotel suite the local government had assigned to the Dirksen delegation, watching a scene that was opening entirely new avenues of discovery about the world of mages. Rhys was restless as he sat beside him, joined to Castiel's wrist by handcuffs. Castiel smiled. After nearly a week on Pyrene, Rhys seemed to have entirely lost his smug delight at being his guard. The knowledge brought him a modicum of pleasure. It was one of his few sources of happiness in his current situation. Rhys had been ruthless and exacting in his performance of his duties. The only time he would take off the handcuffs was when Castiel needed to use the bathroom, and then he fastened the other cuff to a pipe before going outside to wait. Within a couple of days the metal bands had begun to chafe both their wrists. Rhys pulled down his sleeve to act as a buffer, doing nothing to help Castiel naturally, but it was clear the cuff continued to irritate him. After all, as long as Castiel was fastened to Rhys, Rhys was fastened to him. Rhys might have the freedom to dictate where they went and what they did to an extent, but he was equally inconvenienced and restricted. He took out his frustration on Castiel through insults and taunts, though the mean words did not seem to make him feel any better. Castiel had found he could bear it all if he clung to the notion that Rhys was suffering almost as much as himself. Then the news had arrived that the landing party might have found the mages, and the possibility had thrown a new light on everything. Only they hadn't apparently found Castiel's mages, but some mages, rather a lot of them. Commander Key got the credit for the discovery. When he and the rest of the landing party had put out feelers, asking about strangers from Outsystem who had arrived recently, specifically a young woman with 5 children, the answers that came back were entirely unexpected. No one remembered seeing that particular group, but the local gossip was full of news that a gathering of wilder folk was going on, out on the prairie, and that people had been arriving for weeks in one way or another. No one minded, nor did anything about it, except to speculate what they were doing. The land was public, and the wilder folk did no harm. They were expected to leave the place undamaged, as they always did. Anyone else might have ignored the information as irrelevant. Castiel certainly thought so the first time he heard it. What could possibly be interesting or useful about a group of vagrants setting up camp, probably in order to abuse brain-destroying drugs and perform weird rituals? But Key did not seem to dismiss any information until he knew it to be worthless. The commander had inquired more about this group and sent out soldiers dressed in civilian clothes to try to enter the camp. The attempt only brought more questions. There was no road to the campsite. The wilder folk seemed to have walked a day or more through long prairie grass to reach it, though there were no tracks. So Key had sent in the spy drones, and that was when everything had been blown out of the water. Castiel never tired of watching the feed from the tiny drones, which looked like flies. He had never seen so many mages all in one place at once. He had never even imagined so many existed. Mother had always avoided talking about anything to do with mages unless father forced her. Consequently, Castiel's knowledge of them was sparse. He had formed the impression that casting was something done rarely and for special purposes. Yet the images from the encampment showed people starting fires, transporting objects or themselves, rising water from a spring, and performing other casts as if it were the most ordinary behaviour. "Your sister led us to a nest of mages," Rhys sneered. "You should be proud." "Bullshit," Castiel replied. "We don't even know if she's on Pyrene, let alone at that campsite. No reports have come in about her. She's here, I'd bet money on it. It's only a matter of time until she turns up." "I doubt it. If she's on Pyrene, where is she?" Castiel nodded toward the screen that displayed the drone feed. "We've seen hours of recordings now, and no one spotted her. Unless you have, and you're lying." "Why would I lie? Why would I want to protect her?" "Yeah, you're right. I was forgetting what a snivelling little squealer you are. You wouldn't piss on your family if it was on fire." Castiel couldn't think of a suitable comeback, so he only said, "You know what Carina looks like, and the rest of them too. If any of my siblings were there, you would have seen them by now." Key came into the room. Sable was with him. Castiel hadn't seen her for days, while she and Barrett had been attending meetings with the Pyrenian governments. Sable's garb had reverted to its usual expensive simplicity. Key turned off the drone feed and addressed the room.
We have received permission from the Pyrenians to round up the mages and deport them. What we're actually going to do is surround the encampment overnight and move in at dawn, killing as many as we can. Realistically, taking into account these people's special abilities, we can't expect to wipe them all out, but we should be able to make a serious dent in their numbers and make them think twice before ever interfering in Dirksen business. The rest of the company is on its way down from the Elsinore as I speak.
Killing as many as we can? It was to be a massacre. The deliberate, controlled mass murder of unarmed people who had committed no crimes and had no clan affiliation. Castiel had thought Key was somewhat soft-hearted. That was what his interrogation techniques had seemed to indicate. It appeared that impression had been incorrect. Rhys shifted in his seat beside Castiel. When he looked at the older boy, Rhys had turned pale. Was he shocked? Even Castiel himself was surprised by the viciousness of Key's plan. The commander certainly didn't pull his punches. Or was the idea Sable's? She wasn't the head of the clan for nothing. Key went on to explain the finer points of the operation, which was to take place at sunrise tomorrow. Castiel wondered what he and Rhys were supposed to be doing while all this bloodshed went on. The commander was in the middle of stating the importance of separating the mages from their elixir at all costs, when Sable raised a hand to her ear and frowned. She had heard some news. Her features brightened with uncharacteristic glee. She placed a hand on Key's arm, signalling him to stop. She whispered in his ear, and then swiftly strode out. Key's dark eyes focused on Castiel, and he gave a small smile.
You're in luck, Castiel Scherer. We've found Carina and the rest of your sisters and brothers. I think it's time you had a family reunion.
Chapter 25. Carina and her family stepped from the prairie onto the dust road. Their priority was to find somewhere they could sleep tonight. Carina planned on leaving Parthenia in charge while she and Bryce went out to look for work. The wages for the low-level jobs they might expect to find would be small, and they had 5 children to feed as well as themselves. That would place a considerable delay on Carina's plan to return to Ostalon and face up to Castiel. It would take a long time to save enough for the passage to the planet, yet there wasn't anything she could do about it. Protecting her siblings came first. The suburb the mages had entered was old and unkempt. Carina found this a little odd. Usually newer buildings were found at the edge of metropolises. That was where expansion took place. On the other hand, Pyrene was not a rich, quickly developing place. Until she could afford to buy an interface, they would have to rely on face-to-face encounters to find lodgings and work. Carina's fingers closed around the local currency Jace had given her, which was tucked into her pocket. All they needed was a room and a bathroom. A kitchen would be good too. Cooking at home was usually cheaper than buying street food. "Should we knock at someone's door and ask if they know anyone who has a place to rent?" Parthenia asked. "Let's walk a few more streets into the city," said Carina. They passed along the wide roads, lined with trees and one-story houses. It was not the kind of neighborhood where she would expect to find rental places. The area was somewhere that families lived, children growing up and playing in the large yards. As they walked, Carina remembered a similar search on Ostalon, trying to find work and a place to stay. She also recalled Rhys Dirksen and his convoluted plan to return her to his mother's clutches. At the time, his assertions that he'd planned on leaving the Dirksens had seemed convincing. Perhaps he had been genuinely considering the idea, but loyalty to his family had won out in the end. "I'm tired," Oriana announced. "I want to sit down. Riding on that horse hurt my bottom." "Oriana," said Fern, exasperation edging his tone. "Stop complaining. We're all tired." "I'm only saying," his sister replied, indignant. "We could ask at one of these houses if they know somewhere we can stay," said Parthenia. Carina didn't hold out much hope, but it wouldn't hurt to try. They had walked a few 100 meters into the city. "Okay," she said. "I'll ask. You all wait here." While the children clustered on the sidewalk, she strode to the nearest house and looked into the security panel. If anyone was home, their house system would notify them they had a visitor. She waited. A minute later, the door opened. A short old woman stood in the doorway and removed buds from her ears. "Yes?" "Sorry for disturbing you. We're looking for somewhere to stay." She glanced at her siblings and saw them through an outsider's eyes, dusty, dishevelled, and needy-looking. How different from the rich, privileged children she had first met. They had descended to a level of society very familiar to her. "I was wondering if you might be able to point us in the direction of a place to rent." The old woman's gaze took in Carina, Bryce, and the boys and girls in one brief look. "You won't find anything like that around here. You need to go into the city centre." "Okay, thanks." Carina turned and stepped down from the porch. As she returned to her waiting family, she shook her head. But then the old woman called out, "Hey, wait a minute. Come back." When Carina reached the porch again, the old woman said, "How much are you willing to pay? I have a spare room. It isn't much, but you could put a couple of mattresses on the floor." Carina had no idea how much to offer. She named a sum that seemed fair for a week's rent. When the woman's eyes widened and she quickly accepted, Carina realized she'd suggested too much. "Could I see the room first?" If it was tiny or awful, she would back out of the deal. The old woman introduced herself as Bridget and invited Carina into the house. "I'm Tamira," Carina said. "Most people call me Tammy." She doubted that Castiel would have made his way to Pyrene to look for them, but the precaution wouldn't hurt. She would tell the children to make up fake names as well. She hoped Darius would remember to use them. The room was not tiny or awful. It was large and clean, though Bridget had used it as a storeroom. "I can move that stuff out in a jiffy. What do you think?" Carina thought that as somewhere they could stay for the next week while they got on their feet, the room would do fine. She told Bridget she would take it. "But we don't have any mattresses. Will it bother you if we sleep on the floor?" "Makes no difference to me. You can swing from the ceiling for all I care." As Carina walked through the house again on her way to tell the family the good news, she saw that Bridget's furniture was old and threadbare, and the place had not been decorated for many years. She felt less bad about overestimating her offer for the rent. The woman could clearly use the money. "Are you Wilderfolk?" Bridget asked before Carina stepped through the front door. "Wilderfolk?" Bridget looked down, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." "It's okay, but I don't know what you're talking about." "Are you from the group camping out on the prairie right now?" Carina didn't see any reason to lie, and she couldn't think up a credible background story at such short notice. "Yes, we are." "Is that what people call us?" "We do. I hope you don't think it's rude." "No, it's fine." Carina's curiosity was piqued. "What do people say about us?" "Only that you all seem to meet up every few years, here on Pyrene or somewhere nearby. You gather and live in a camp for a few months and then you go. No one knows why for sure, though I've heard some rumours. Not that I believe them, of course. People love to gossip and think the worst of everyone, don't they? I'm sure you're all fine folk, just going about your business. Nothing wrong with that." It would have been impossible for the Pyrenians not to notice several hundred people gathering for months, but Carina hadn't considered how the matching might be perceived by outsiders. Should she send to Jace to tell him what she'd learned? But she couldn't if she wanted to. She didn't have anything of his to locate him. The money he'd given her would be imprinted with the trace of many hands. Anyway, she decided, Jace and the rest of the Mage Council were probably aware of the mage's image as wilderfolk. It seemed harmless enough. I'll go and tell my family to come in. Oriana was delighted with the news that she didn't have to walk any farther. She and the rest of Carina's family followed her into Bridget's home. The old woman was already moving things out of her spare room. Carina and Bryce offered to help her, while the children opened the bags the young mages had given them and began to take out blankets and other donated possessions. Soon the room was empty of Bridget's stored boxes, which she had crammed into spare corners of her home. From what Carina could tell, Bridget seemed to live alone. She guessed the old woman might have been tempted by the idea of some company as well as the rent money. Carina watched her brothers and sisters as they unpacked and made themselves at home, gabbling noisily and bantering with each other. Company was certainly something Carina could provide, in spades. Then she noticed Oriana wasn't helping. She sat in a corner, her arms folded and her lips in a pout. Fern asked, "What's wrong with you, Oriana? Why won't you help?" "I don't like this place. I want to go back on the prairie. I don't want to live in a house. I liked our tent and living with all the mages. It isn't fair." Carina rolled her eyes. Oriana was turning into a real pain in the ass. Something would have to be done about that, but if the girl's spoilt entitlement was the worst Carina had to face, she would be happy to settle for it. Chapter 26. Bridget had been kind enough to cook them dinner, so Carina and Bryce didn't have to leave the house to buy food. The woman wouldn't even accept the money Carina offered her. In fact, she'd seemed embarrassed that she wanted to pay, and she had wondered if she had violated a cultural expectation, perhaps insulting Bridget with her offer. It was always hard to navigate the social norms when visiting a new planet. They were too many to fit around Bridget's small table, so they ate in their room, sitting cross-legged on the cloths that other mages had given them. The children had also discovered light metallic bowls, plates and cutlery among the offerings. The generosity of the young mages at the matching gave Carina a twinge of regret. Had she done the right thing to leave, taking Darius with her? Would the current gathering be the last in the history of mages? She rubbed her forehead to ease the headache she'd had for hours. "What's wrong?" Bryce asked, before popping a spoonful of Bridget's delicious stew into his mouth. "Just wondering if we should be doing this." "No, we shouldn't," Oriana said. "But it isn't too late to change our minds. We could transport back to the camp right now if we wanted to. We all know where it is." "Don't be stupid," said Fern. "What would Bridget think if she came in to find an empty room when no one has gone out of the door?" "Well, we don't have to leave like that," Oriana retorted. "We could leave in the morning, go somewhere quiet where no one can see us." "No," said Parthenia. "We have to return to Ostalon. We have to find Castiel and stop him from helping the Dirksons." "Maybe I should go back to Magda, Carina," Darius said, concern written in his big brown eyes. "We aren't going anywhere," said Carina, recalling guiltily that she had not allowed her brother the opportunity to say goodbye to his teacher and mentor. Her headache was pounding, and the split in her family's opinions was only making it worse. If anything was clear, it was that they had to stay together and have a common purpose. Their time at the matching had only served to divide everyone. "We have a plan, and we're sticking to it." "You have a plan more like," said Oriana. Fern poked her in the ribs and she shoved him in the chest with the heel of her hand. "Stop it!" Carina snapped.
"Come on, kids," said Bryce. "Knock it off. Things aren't going to be easy for the next few months. We need to make a special effort to be nice and get along."
Fern and Oriana looked daggers at each other, but they stopped fighting. However, Oriana pushed her spoon into her bowl and put the bowl down. "I've had enough." She stood up and walked to a corner of the room where she began to make herself a bed on the floor.
"Don't worry," Bryce said softly to Carina. "She'll come around."
Oriana overheard and narrowed her eyes at him. She viciously plumped up a cushion and threw it down. The small spat left everyone out of sorts. The rest of their dinner was eaten in silence, except for the scraping of spoons. Fern finished Oriana's stew, and when everyone had eaten, Parthenia offered to take the utensils to the kitchen to wash. Nala went with her. The sight of the little girl trotting alongside her older sister, her arms full of dirty bowls, warmed Carina's heart. She was so glad she had extracted Nala from her brother's clutches. How odd it was that the sibling who had once had the closest relationship with Castiel had turned out to be the least trouble. While Parthenia and Nala were filling Bridget's kitchen washer, the old woman came into the bedroom. "Is everything all right? Will you be turning in for the night soon?" "Yes," Carina answered. "It's been a long day." And she and Bryce would have a long day tomorrow, looking for work. She would have to talk to Parthenia about how she would keep the children occupied. Maybe she could help them practice their casting, providing Bridget wasn't around. "I hope you sleep well," Bridget said. "It won't be very comfortable lying on the floor. I wish I had something I could lend you, but I don't have anything." "Don't worry about it, please," said Carina. "We're used to it." Bridget left them, and a few minutes later Parthenia and Nala were back with their clean utensils. Everyone prepared to go to sleep. Realistically, the children would have to find ways to contribute to the household budget if the family was ever to leave Pyrene. Carina recalled the years she'd spent helping Nine-Eye gather and polish beautiful stones to sell. It hadn't been an easy life, but at the time she hadn't known any different, so it hadn't seemed so bad. The same could not be said for her sisters and brothers, but they would manage. Even Oriana would get over herself eventually. No matter how hard things got, at least they would have each other. Oriana had already lain down, her back to everyone. Carina helped the others to fix up their beds. In truth, the hard floor wouldn't be as comfortable as the compressed prairie grass under the tent at the matching, but they would be okay. Everything would be okay. Carina was sound asleep, her head on Bryce's shoulder, when light and noises wakened her. She opened her eyes and found herself looking into a muzzle. She drew in a sharp breath and stiffened. For a moment she thought she was having a nightmare. But no, she was awake, and what was happening was very, very real. "Don't move," said the soldier at the other end of the weapon. Assuming the order didn't apply to her eyes, Carina's gaze roved the room. Another soldier stood next to the first, pointing a weapon in the direction of Bryce's head. From the tenseness of his muscles, she guessed he was already awake. She squinted toward the door and was entirely unsurprised to see Castiel standing there. What did surprise her was that Rhys was with him, and that the two were handcuffed to each other. This fact threw her into confusion. Was Rhys guarding Castiel, or vice versa, and why? "Get up," said a voice to her left. Another soldier had spoken, presumably to Parthenia or Darius. Both of them had been lying on that side of her when they'd all gone to sleep. She heard movement and the sound of quiet sobs. "Darius, I hope you're happy taking a 6-year-old prisoner," she said to Castiel. The soldier knocked her forehead with the muzzle. "Shut up." She had been expecting some kind of gloating retort, or at the very least a smirk from Castiel, but she got nothing. The dark mage looked gloomy. Rhys's expression was even gloomier. What was going on? "Your turn," her guard said. She slowly rose to her feet, taking in the room with her improved vantage point. Bryce stood up beside her, ordered to by his guard. Parthenia and Darius also had a guard each, and so did Nala and Fern. That made 6 soldiers in total. The Dirksons were clearly taking no chances. The men and women were armed, but not wearing armor, Carina noted, trying to figure out how the hell she could help her family escape. She needed to do something, and soon. Once they were all locked away somewhere, it would be much harder to regain their freedom. The soldiers had already found the weapons Jace had given them. The bag was open, and next to the door, its contents plain to see. The elixir supplies were out of reach, and even if she managed to reach them, there was the eternal problem of the lag. She would be dead before she could cast. Darius's guard was searching him, roughly patting down the little boy as if he were an arch criminal who could pull a knife on them at any moment. Satisfied that Darius wasn't about to murder anyone, the soldier moved to her while Parthenia's guard covered her and her brother. The soldier's hands were thorough as he felt her body, but she wasn't carrying anything useful on her person. She'd mistakenly thought they were relatively safe in Bridget's home. The old woman must have betrayed them. Her embarrassment when Carina had offered to pay for their food suddenly made more sense. Bridget must have made the call by then. Had the authorities issued an alert about a Wilderfolk family coming in from the prairie? Maybe they'd offered a reward. The old woman seemed poor enough to be easily bribed. It was Bryce's turn to be searched. "I'm sorry, Carina," said Rhys. Castiel stared at him. "Sorry?" she asked. "Sorry for what? For imprisoning children? For subjecting us all to a life of captivity and slavery? Or maybe for something else? I'd love to hear which of the hundreds of thousands of crimes your clan has perpetrated that you're sorry for." Rhys could not meet her gaze. "I thought it was all necessary, for the greater good, you know. I had no idea what my clan was capable of. I've been naive. I understand that now." She shook her head in disgust. "Please spare me." Then she added, "If you feel so bad, why not let us go? There's still time. Order these soldiers to release us." "I can't do that. They aren't operating under my orders. I'm only here as an observer." "The Dirksons plan to kill all the mages," said Castiel, sneering. "That's what's eating him up. Even I think it's excessive, and I guess that's saying something." "What?" asked Parthenia. Her mouth hung open and her cheeks lost their colour. "It's nearly dawn, so they'll be starting soon," said Castiel. "Out at that camp on the prairie. You must know it. That's why you're here, right? Sable Dirkson and Key found out all about it yesterday. They plan to send a clear message to mages to never use their powers against them." "But why?" asked Parthenia, horror in her voice. "Why would they think mages would harm them? Mages only ever do good." "I beg to differ," said Castiel, smirking. "This is your fault," yelled Parthenia. "You've made the Dirksons feel threatened by all you've done. If any one of those mages die, you'll have blood on your hands." "Make her be quiet," Castiel said to the soldiers, but they ignored him. "Anyway," he continued, "let's not forget who started this. It was you who did all that casting for Father, helping him with all those business deals. That was what first alerted the Dirksons to our existence. They've feared our powers since then." "That was because he made me," Parthenia exclaimed. Carina was struggling to absorb the news that the mages at the matching were about to be attacked. All the young women and men, Justin, Jace, Magda, they could all die. Of course, as soon as they realized what was happening, they would be able to transport themselves away, but there was bound to be a lot of bloodshed. She was also confused about Castiel's place among the Dirksons. He seemed to have no status if the soldiers didn't follow his orders. "What are you doing?" she asked him. "Why are you here?" "I'm to make sure none of you casts. Not that I really give a shit. Not anymore." So Castiel was in Rhys's custody, and Rhys was undergoing a moment of remorse. Carina wondered if she could exploit the situation somehow. Maybe there was a chance they could escape. Then it hit her. Where was Oriana? The revelation came as such a shock she swung around to check her sister really was missing. "Keep still," her guard barked, and swiped the side of her head with the muzzle of his gun. The crack dazed her. "Hey, leave her alone," shouted Bryce. His guard thrust his weapon into his chest. Blood trickled down her face. Where had Oriana gone? Chapter 27. Oriana listened to the sound of everyone's breathing. One by one, most of her sisters and brothers had fallen asleep, and so had Bryce. Only Carina remained awake. Now, finally, Oriana heard her eldest sister's breaths become deep and regular, like the others. She would wait another 5 minutes or so, and then she would leave. While she waited, Oriana remembered the nights she had snuck out of her room when she'd lived on Ithia and mother and father had been alive. Those secret nocturnal excursions around the mansion and into the garden had been the only time she'd felt truly alone. No servants had been watching her, surreptitiously or not. Father had not been silently judging her with his cold eyes. Mother had not been regarding her with pain and sorrow in every look. In those brief times she had wandered father's estate in the dead of night, when the entire household slept, Oriana had felt free. It had been an illusion. None of them had been free, not even father. He had been a slave to his pride, arrogance, and ambition. Was what she planned to do due to pride or arrogance? No. She only wanted to be free. She wanted to choose her own life. She had been through enough hard times. She deserved to make her own decisions on how she lived. Oriana slowly sat up and pushed down her blanket. Fern was sound asleep, dribbling like he always did, the starlight through the window lighting up his face. Everyone else was shadowy lumps in the darkness. She had already thought out her list of what she needed to take. Clothes, elixir, her brush and toothbrush, and a couple of blankets. That would be all she would need. She had packed a bag while she'd been getting ready for bed. No one had even noticed what she was doing. A sense of self-satisfaction warmed her. She had made careful preparations. She wasn't a silly little girl running away for no reason. She had made a decision maturely, and now she was going to act on it. Oriana stood up, picking up her filled bag from the floor. She picked up her shoes in her other hand. She would put them on when she was outside the house, so the noise of her footsteps wouldn't wake anyone up. As she took a last look at her family and Bryce, something tugged at her heart, causing a sharp pain. Would she see her brothers and sisters again? She didn't know, but she hoped so. "Don't be silly," she told herself. "Of course you'll see them again. They'll all attend the matching eventually. You can see them there." Feeling a little better, Oriana tiptoed across the room with its sleeping figures around the edges, eased open the door and stepped out. She closed the door, leaving it slightly ajar to avoid making any noise. The hall was very dark, but she could see light through a window in the door. Hoping the woman who owned the house didn't set her security system to monitor internal movement, Oriana walked along the hall, opened the front door and slipped out. She guessed it had to be the early hours of the morning. Lights were on in the distant city centre, but the only lights she could see by were the handful of dim street lights that lined the road. She shivered. The coldness and dampness of the night was already invading her bones. She looked up and down the street. Would anyone see her if she transported right here and now? Probably not, but there was no sense in taking chances. She needed to go somewhere she would not be observed. She walked along the sidewalk, heading back toward the prairie. She imagined how nice it would be to live among the young mages again, carefree and happy. At the campsite, she didn't have to hide what she was or live in constant fear of discovery and capture. Someone would take pity on her and accept her into their family, she was sure. Perhaps that nice ranger, Jace, from Ostalon. On the other hand, that wasn't such a good idea. Castiel was on Ostalon, and he was the one member of her family she did not want to meet again. It really didn't matter who she ended up with. All the mages were nice and kind. She would find someone. She wouldn't have to live the lifetime of hardship Carina seemed intent upon. Oriana scanned the road from side to side, trying to find somewhere not overlooked. In a few minutes' time she would be back at the prairie, and her new life would begin. Chapter 28. Carina saw Castiel watching her, amusement in his eyes. He knew Oriana was missing, and he hadn't said anything. Rhys had to know too. He'd met all her brothers and sisters. The only person he hadn't met was Bryce, who had appeared later. Both Castiel and Rhys had not let on to the soldiers that the party they were taking prisoner had one extra person, Bryce, and that one of them was missing. And because there were enough guards for one per prisoner, they hadn't suspected anything. "Carina," said Darius, "where did Oriana go?" "Huh?" said one of the soldiers. "Who are you talking about?" "Shit!" Carina stared at her young brother, willing him to be silent. He looked back, confused, and then opened his mouth to speak again. "No, Darius, no!" Then he was gone, vanished into thin air. Parthenia had disappeared too. "What the fuck?" a soldier yelled. "How do they do that?" "Never mind that," shouted another. "We have to stop them. Grab the rest." Darius and Parthenia had been transported. Oriana must have done it. She had to be watching them from somewhere. The only possible place was the window. Carina forced herself not to look at it. Her guard lunged at her, trying to grab her arm. She shoved him to one side. Oriana would be preparing to transport the others. If the guard was holding on to one of the mages, he might transport with them. "Fight!" Carina cried. "Push them away from you!" She heard the hiss of a pulse round and the thump of a body hitting the floor. Her guard reached for her again. She kicked his knee and heard a crunch. The man screamed. She spun around. Fern was down. His bastard guard had fired at him. But then Fern was gone, and so was Nala. Only herself and Bryce were left. Carina's guard was rolling and groaning on the floor, but Bryce was locked in a struggle with his. Castiel and Rhys stood in the doorway and did nothing. From outside came the sound of someone shouting. "What's going on in there?" Carina ran at the soldier holding on to Bryce. She was within a step of him when she transported. Carina was in darkness, momentum carrying her forward. She crashed into Bryce and the soldier, and all three of them fell to the ground, hitting grass. They had to be somewhere in the yards around Bridget's house, but as she tussled with the guard who had grabbed Bryce, she realized they were out on the prairie. A stiff wind was blowing, causing the tents to flap. "Let go of him!" Carina shouted, standing up to get a better look at Bryce and his assailant. The guard's weapon was trapped under him, and he was rolling around too much to punch him in the jaw. So she did the next best thing. She kicked one of his legs open and drove her heel into the man's groin as hard as she could. That persuaded him to give up. While the guard rolled on the ground in silent agony, Bryce shook himself and stood up.
Remind me to never piss you off.
Carina relieved the guard of his weapon, then straightened up and turned a full circle. I don't believe it. Oriana had transported them all back to the mage's camp, the camp that was about to be attacked. Darius, Parthenia, Fern and Nala were all here too. She scanned the horizon beyond the tents full of sleeping mages. A rosy patch told her dawn was about to break. Oriana suddenly appeared, transporting herself in. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I'm sorry I ran away. I wanted to come back here. I didn't want to spend all my life scraping to get by, always on the move. But then I realized I would miss you all too much. I went back to the house and I saw the soldiers and...
You're sorry, said Bryce. You just saved all our lives.
Not yet, said Carina. The sensible thing would be to leave right away, to transport the hell out of the massacre waiting to happen. But there was no way she could abandon her kindred to such a terrible fate. We have to wake everyone up.
What?
Oriana asked. Why?
The Dirksons are about to attack, said Fern.
Oriana's eyes grew wide, and her brothers and sisters seemed frozen by the enormity of the evil about to befall the young mages. Carina ran to the nearest tent, ripped open the flap and yelled, Wake up! You're being attacked! You have to transport away from the camp! Come on, hurry, she said to Bryce and her siblings. Help me! This galvanized them into action, and they began to run to the other tents. I'll go and tell Magda, said Darius. No, you won't, Carina replied. You're staying here with me. She was not about to lose her brother to the spirit mage again. And then she realized what she had done. The camp was about to come under fire, and she had just sent her brothers and sisters away from her, where she could not protect them. They would all become separated. How would they find each other again? Wait, she shouted. Come back! But Parthenia and the others didn't hear her. The noise in the camp was growing louder as the young mages woke up and asked each other what was going on. Bryce had also disappeared. Jace, she needed to speak to him. Or Justin, someone who was in charge. The mages she had woken were not transporting. They were standing around and chatting. You have to get out of here, she yelled at a group. The camp is about to be attacked. Aren't you the one who left? One of them asked. The new spirit mage's sister? Yes, and I've come back to warn you. You must leave. Dirkson's soldiers are about to attack and kill everyone. But how do you know? It would take too long to explain. You must believe me. A scream echoed across from somewhere out at the edge of the camp, borne along on the strong breeze. It's begun. Now do you believe me? The mage's expressions grew frightened. One of them nodded and returned to her tent. Grab whatever you can, quickly. Take all the elixir you can carry and transport as far from here as possible. Hide out somewhere until it's safe to leave Pyrene. But before you transport, send to someone else in the camp and tell them to do the same. Carina grabbed Darius's hand. Do you know where Jason Justin's tent is? No, only the spirit mages. Oh, then the spirit mages it'll have to be. Screams and shouts were sounding from another direction. The soldiers were closing in. Mages were already dying. She had to try to save as many as she could, but she couldn't do it alone. By the time everyone received a warning, the soldiers would be halfway through the camp. In fact, now she thought about it, the spirit mage was exactly the person she needed to see. When they burst into the old woman's tent, she was sound asleep, despite the increasing mayhem going on around her. She grabbed Magda's shoulder and roughly shook it. Be gentle, Carina, said Darius. She's very old. I know, but... She bit her lip. Without the spirit mage's help, hundreds of people would die. The rheumy eyes opened and blinked blearily. What? Carina, my dear, you came back. A scream of protest suddenly cut off came through the walls of the tent. What was that? Magda asked. Can you send to everyone in the camp? You summoned them all, right? Can you send to them? It's very important." "Yes, She sat up, pushing down the blankets that covered her. "What's happening?" "The Dirksons are attacking, and they plan on killing every mage they find." Magda's mouth gaped. She looked at Darius. "It's true," he said. "Bring me my elixir." Darius had already grabbed it. He handed the spirit mage the canister and she removed the lid. "Do it with me, Darius. I'll need your help. You know how." After he nodded his agreement, she added, "Drink half of it. You'll need it." Between them, Magda and Darius drank the entire canister of elixir. Then they held hands and closed their eyes. All around, the sounds of fear, dismay, and confusion were rising, bubbling up like water in the spring at the center of the encampment. But Carina could hear another sound, a muted, rustling roar. She couldn't figure out what it was. Magda and Darius unclasped their hands. As Magda opened her eyes, her skin increased in pallor. She looked exhausted. "I've done my best. I cannot do any more right now." Darius also looked tired. Then Carina suddenly recognized the sound that had been puzzling her. It was fire. The Dirksons had set the camp on fire. Rather than go from tent to tent, they were trying to drive all the mages out into the open, where the soldiers could pick them off like hunters shooting game. She felt as though she were about to vomit. "Can we go and find Parthenia and the others now?" Darius asked. "We can." Then a thought struck her. "Darius, can you send to them, even though you don't have anything of theirs, the same as you did just now to the mages in the camp?" His little face brightened. "Yes, I can." But then his features darkened again. "But not to Bryce or Nala." "It's okay, we can find them. Tell the others to come here, to the spirit mage's tent." While waiting for Darius to cast, she said to Magda, "You should leave. It isn't safe anywhere in the camp now. The soldiers will be here soon. Or the fire will reach you." "No, my place is here, until everyone has gone. My role is to save magehood for the future, and I will do that to my last breath." "But you're the repository of our history. If you die, our history dies with you." "Our history did not seem so important to you yesterday," said Magda, her eyes twinkling. "You have a lot to learn, Carina. If I run out on my people, there's no point in me remembering anything." She did not have time to argue with the old woman. She knew what she was doing. "Did you send to the others?" she asked Darius. "I did." "Right, let's go." "Wait," said Magda. "Take some elixir with you, or you won't be able to transport yourselves out." Carina grabbed canisters for herself and Darius and ran out of the tent. The sky was red. The hues were from the rising sun and the burning encampment. Smoke and flames were billowing upward in the far reaches of the camp, but the breeze was blowing the fire closer every second. Somewhere out there were Fern, Parthenia, and Oriana, hopefully now heading toward the spirit mage's tent. She would have to find Bryce and Nala. How, she didn't know yet. On the plus side, mages were transporting away from the site. She could see them leaving their tents, clutching bags, and then disappearing. She could also see shadowy moving forms inside tents, backlit by the glow of flames, vanish from sight. "Darius," she said, "I'm going to transport you to the—" Where could she send her brother that would be safe? "But I want to stay with you." She was forced to acquiesce, as she could not think of a place on Pyrene where Darius could wait for her in safety. "Okay, but stick to me like glue. Don't leave my side." Darius gripped her hand and they set off. As soon as she found Bryce and Nala, they would return to Magda's tent to rendezvous with the others, and then they would all leave together. She didn't think there was anything else she could do to help the stricken mages. Though she carried the guard's weapon, she could not fight off tens, perhaps hundreds, of soldiers by herself. Holding Darius's hand tightly, she ran along an avenue of tents. She shouted to the remaining mages to leave immediately, driving home Magda and Darius's message. She and Darius were running toward the flames, but she couldn't help it. The soldiers had set fire to the camp on all sides. Danger lay in every direction. Where was Bryce? Where was Nala? Someone was heading toward them. She recognized her sister. "Parthenia!" she shouted. Her sister had Nala with her. If there had been time, Carina would have kissed her. "Don't stop. Go to Magda's and wait for us. If you see any soldiers or the fire comes near, transport to the trail we followed on the horses, about halfway along." Parthenia nodded and Carina's two sisters ran past her. Her heart lightening a fraction, she ran on. The campsite was beginning to look deserted. She hoped the majority of the mages had gotten away. The Dirksons would scour the planet for them, of course, but if the young men and women were careful, they stood a good chance of not being captured. Carina and Darius were nearing the flames. She didn't dare to move any closer, yet there was no sign of Bryce. She guessed he must have gone to another area. If she didn't find him soon, the entire place would be ablaze. Worse still, the roaring of the flames made it impossible to hear pulse rounds being fired. She had no idea if troops were approaching. "Jace!" Darius screamed. He was staring off to one side, his hand like a vice on Carina's. When she saw what her brother was looking at, her heart froze. A pillar of fire was stumbling between the tents. Was it Jace? She could not tell if it was him or his brother. The mage must have stayed behind after Magda's warning to ensure the young mages transported. The flames had overtaken him. And that wasn't all. A soldier was emerging behind him in heat-resistant armor, his head covered in a specialized helmet and carrying an oxygen-mixed tank on his back. The soldier took aim at Jace, preparing to finish him off. But Carina's weapon was already at her shoulder and spitting pulse rounds at the man. She didn't release her trigger until he was down. Darius was already fumbling with the lid of his container, tears streaming down his face. "There isn't anything you can do," she said. She didn't know a cast that would extinguish flames, and even if she did, Jace was already too burned to survive. "Yes, there is," Darius shouted. "Please help me, Carina." Still doubtful, she unscrewed Darius's canister and held it to his lips. The small boy swallowed a mouthful of elixir. Too late. It was too late. She could not bear to imagine the agony Jace was in. Perhaps it would be kinder to do it herself. She couldn't watch. If Darius put out the flames, what would they do then? "I did it," Darius announced. The man was on the ground. The flames had gone out. By some miracle, her brother had invented a new cast to douse fire. Should she have let him? "Stay behind me. Don't look, okay?" Jace was still alive. His burned body moved slowly on charred grass as they approached him. What had she done? He was dying. He deserved a quicker death. Darius peeked from behind her and gasped at what he saw. Nevertheless, he said, "I can heal him." "I told you not to look. And no, you can't. You can't heal a fatal condition. I think I'm going to have to." She fingered the trigger of her weapon. How would she explain to Darius what she had to do? "You cannot heal him, Darius," Magda said. "But I can." The old woman had transported here, somehow knowing what had happened. She knelt down next to Jace and gently touched his burned skin. She opened her flask and drank elixir before she began to cast. Carina didn't know if Magda would be successful, but she also had no time to find out. She had to find Bryce and get out of here. "Come with me," she said to Darius. "But what about—" "Don't argue." Her little brother in tow, she fled the grisly scene. They hadn't gone more than 20 paces, however, before she saw figures approaching through the flames. Soldiers. They were walking steadily forward, scanning from side to side. She halted. They hadn't yet seen her or Darius. There were about 10 of them. The minute she shot at them, they would shoot back, endangering her brother. Should she try to get out of sight or cast transport? Any movement was bound to catch the soldiers' attention. In the end, the decision was made for her. Darius had spotted the troops too. He gave a shriek, ripped his hand from hers, and sprinted back toward Magda and Jace. She had no choice except to follow him. A pulse round grazed her shoulder. They'd been spotted. She began to run a haphazard zigzag, desperately trying to avoid the soldiers' fire. Darius was running in a dead straight line. It was only a matter of time. He had reached Magda and Jace, but the scene was not at all what she expected. Magda was lying on her side, one arm flailed outward. Jace remained on his back, but all his burned skin had disappeared. He was alive. Darius threw himself onto Magda. From the old woman's staring eyes, Carina realized she was dead. The spirit mage had brought Jace back to life at the sacrifice of her own. A pulse round hit Carina square on her back. Unbearable agony spread from the wound. Her legs collapsed under her, and she found herself falling forward. This was no stunning blow. The soldiers' weapons were set to kill. This was the end. Distantly, she could hear Darius crying out, howling in pain and grief. "I will save you, Carina. I will heal you." As her life ebbed away, she whispered, "No, don't, Darius." Not like that. Not like Magda had done. Chapter 29. Carina opened her eyes and saw a smoky sky, red with the reflected flames of a fire. The air was filled with the fire's roar and the tang of burning. She remembered she was on Ostalon, in the basement of a house, and the Shurers were bombarding the city. She had to get everyone out, but her leg was broken. No, that wasn't right. That had happened weeks ago. Where was she now? Suddenly, the memory of Pyrene, the matching, and everything that had happened flooded back. "No!" she shouted, trying to sit up. "No, Darius, don't do it!" "She's alive!" exclaimed Parthenia. "Let's go!" A firm hand grasped Carina's wrist. "No!" she repeated. "Stop him! Someone stop him!" Darius had been trying to heal her like Magda had healed Jace, only the spirit mage had died in the attempt. Darius could not give his life for hers. She wouldn't let him. "Stay still," said Parthenia. The grip on her wrist tightened. She felt herself transported. The noise and smell of the fire was gone, and the sky was the pale pink of a natural dawn. She was lying on prairie grass. Her back ached where the pulse round had hit, but she was alive. She was alive, and her little brother had died to heal her. She could not bear it. How could she go on living? She turned onto her side, too anguished even to cry. "Hey," someone said. She recognized Bryce's voice. She felt his hand on her shoulder. So he was okay. He'd escaped from the encampment with them. She was relieved, but she could not feel a flicker of happiness. She would never be happy again. "Carina," said Bryce, "it's all right. We're all going to be okay." She closed her eyes, pressed her lips together, and shook her head. They were not. The understanding that Parthenia and Bryce were acting far too calmly for the situation finally pierced her fears. She sat up. They were out on the prairie, entirely alone, the sea of tall grass stretching out around them. Parthenia had brought them to the place Carina had suggested, along the horse trail into the city. A small body lay nearby, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it. A terrible dread rose up in her when she tried. Bryce was sitting next to her, his face and clothes blackened and smelling of smoke. She paused and swallowed. "Is Darius alive?" "Of course he is. Is that what's bothering you?
He's out of it, but he seems to be okay."
"Oh, thank the stars!" Tears of relief poured from her eyes. She crawled over to her little brother. Like Bryce and everyone else, he bore the marks of the fire, but he was otherwise unharmed, and he was breathing normally. How in the world? She couldn't figure it out. What happened? I only remember being shot.
"I don't know what happened to you," said Bryce. "Oriana and Fern found me and told me we were all meeting at the Spirit Mage's tent. When we arrived there, Parthenia and Nala were waiting, but there was no sign of the mage or you two. We hung around, figuring you would turn up eventually. I think Fern was about to send to you. He was going to let you know we were all ready to go and only needed you to come back, when you and Darius appeared. Darius immediately passed out, and you looked to be half dead, but then you came around. Parthenia decided it was time to get out of there, and here we are."
Carina could only guess at most of it, though there was no doubt in her mind that Darius had saved her life, and apparently at great cost to himself, though not enough to kill him. Perhaps the healing cast had been too much for the old woman, but Darius, being younger, had survived it. He must have transported her and himself to the Spirit Mage's tent before collapsing. But what she could not figure out was why the soldiers had not shot her brother. They had been coming up behind her, and Darius had been right there, clearly a mage and a target to be taken out. Yet they had not shot him. Perhaps they had not been able to bring themselves to kill a little boy. Perhaps there remained a smidgen of humanity at the heart of the most evil people. She thought of Castiel. Though he'd known Oriana had gone missing, he had said nothing to the soldiers who had come to Bridget's house to take his family captive. She also thought of Rhys, who seemed to have finally comprehended the evilness of his clan. She gasped. What had happened to Jace? He'd been alive when the troops had been approaching. Had they shot him or spared him like they had Darius?
"Looking for me, Carina?"
said a deep voice behind her. She swiveled around. The large man was sitting on the grass, entirely unburned and very much alive.
"I forgot," said Bryce. "Darius brought Jace with him too. I was kind of focused on you at the time."
They were all here, all her brothers and sisters, Bryce and even Jace. But how many of the young mages had died in the Dirksons' attack? "Do you know if most of the mages managed to get away?" she asked Jace. The burly man's expression was sad as he replied,
"Not all, but most, thanks to the help of your family."
He paused.
"It's strange how things turn out sometimes. I didn't want you to leave and take Darius from us, yet if you hadn't left, you wouldn't have found out about what the Dirksons planned to do. You wouldn't have warned us, and many more people would have been lost. So that is something to be thankful for."
"I'm sorry that Magda died," said Carina.
"So am I. Perhaps more than you will ever know. She was everything to us. She was our history, our culture, our future. She had barely begun to pass on all she knew to Darius. Now I do not know what will happen. How can we continue when we've lost so much?"
Her heart ached with remorse and sadness. She had been so wrong about Magda. She had misinterpreted the Spirit Mage's deep need to safeguard mage law as a desire to monopolize Darius. She realized how blind she had been, and now there was nothing she could do about it.
"Do not blame yourself for what has happened,"
said Jace, reading her expression.
"The Dirksons are responsible for Magda's fate, not you."
"What should happen to Darius?"
"Though he is a powerful mage, Darius is very young, and he doesn't know anywhere near enough to take over as our clan's Spirit Mage. Everything has changed. A new era in magehood has begun, and I don't know what will happen to us."
"Or perhaps it's the beginning of something new. Maybe we can find a different way of living where we no longer need to skulk and hide." Jace looked downward and didn't answer. It's kind of empty and lonely out here, said Oriana. Are we going to leave soon? Where are we going now? It was a big question, both for their immediate future and their long-term plans. The first thing they had to do was to go somewhere far from the Dirksons' soldiers. But then what? Maybe we should head into the city, Parthenia said. But what about returning to Ostalon eventually? Castiel might go back there. Castiel, said Carina. I don't think we need to worry about him anymore. I'm pretty sure he isn't a danger to anyone. His plan to gain power and privilege has backfired spectacularly. Maybe that guy, Rhys, will take care of him, said Fern.
They certainly didn't seem to be best buddies, Bryce remarked.
Are we going? Fern asked, standing up. He was right to hurry them. The morning was wearing on. Dirkson's soldiers would be scouring the prairie, hoping to find stray mages. Carina sighed. Let's go where we always go, somewhere safe, out of sight, where we won't attract too much attention. Then we'll have to see what we can do to leave Pyrene without any Dirksons or Shurers on our tail. And then what? Asked Oriana. I'm not sure. But in fact, she was. She had always been sure, deep down. She took a breath and said, maybe we should try to find Earth. Jace gave a shake of his head.
You're chasing a dream, Carina.
Do you have a better idea?
I have to admit I don't.
Then a dream is better than nothing. The end. This has been Wildfire and Steel, Mage Saga Book 3, written and narrated by J.J. Green. The next book in the Mage Saga series is Mercenary Mage, Mage Saga Book 4. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.